everybody. Good afternoon. I warmly welcome everyone to our first study day, Journeys Across the Waves, Discovering Irish Identity, in collaboration with the University College Cork, UCC in Ireland, and Julius Maximilians Universität Würzburg in Germany. As you all could see from the program, this study day will focus on Irish identity formation, as well as on Irish, German, and Irish American contact zones and interrelationships. European and transatlantic relations will be looked at, in particular how these relationships play out in texts and narratives. Now, before I get further into the topic, I just wanted to let you know that we take screenshots in the beginning of the session, probably now. So if you do not want to be seen, you have to switch off your camera. And all of the session, as you could already see in the PowerPoint presentation in the beginning, all of the session is videotaped. So switch off your cameras if you don't want to be seen. Screenshots are taken now. Now, today we have 4 presentations, each followed by a discussion. And I would like to ask you not to write any comments into the chat during the lectures and just listen and then participate actively in the discussion after the respective talks. And please use your electronic hands, because sometimes it's very hard to see if you use your natural hands. So use your yellow hands. They are easier to be seen, most probably if we have a presentation right in the middle of the picture. Okay, and then we do not want to lose any more time and start with our today's program and our today's first speaker. It is a great honor for me to introduce Dr. Damian Bracken from UCC to you today. Damian Bracken completed his PhD in 1994, and he examined Latin and Latin-influenced elements of early Irish vernacular law. And his research has focused on Hiberno-Latin literature, especially on the works of St. Columbanus, the earliest writer to leave an identifiable corpus of writings, and the first actually to explore Irish identity. Damian Bracken is interested particularly in exploring Columbanus' works in the context of late antique and early medieval ideals of authority and concepts of orthodoxy. Now, he has taught in the School of History at University College Cork, and also spent periods teaching in the Department of History, Boston College, and in the Department of History, Boston University, where he held the Brian P. Burns Chair in Irish Studies. Now, Damian, we are more than happy to have you here as our first speaker today, and we are now all looking forward to your lecture on St. Patrick, entitled Journey on the Land Beyond Which Nobody Lives. So the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks very much for that, Maria. Thanks for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and involved with this very interesting enterprise and collaboration between our 2 institutions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to test my very limited Zoom skills and your patience to see if I can share my screen. Let me see, share screen.
Yeah, we can see your PowerPoint.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Okay, I'm surprised. I'm surprised even myself.
And so, we can hear you.
Good. So what I propose doing is, I know you sort of, I'm not sure if we want the seminar format or how you want to run this. But what I'll do is I'll give a conventional lecture, but if at any stage anybody wants to ask a question or make a point or contribute, please do. I'd be more than happy to answer questions or to explain things that I should explain in more detail. So my material is probably the most obscure of the texts we're going to be looking at today. And for a modern readership, it's probably the most inaccessible. You should all have copies of the handouts. I hope you've got a copy of the handout. What's on the handout are the works of St. Patrick. And, when we think of St. Patrick, if we ever do, we all have our preconceived notions about shamrocks and green beer and parades in the depths of winter when we should all be indoors. And I must say, every St. Patrick's Day, when I see that, I really feel I should give back my salary. But I don't, and I won't. So what you've got on that is in effect the earliest literature ever written on the island of Ireland. This is where Ireland's literary tradition begins, with these texts. And for a first reading, they might be somewhat less than compelling, and that is largely the scholarly consensus about St. Patrick. When Patrick writes, there's a real emotional charge in his literature, but he doesn't express himself well, and the consensus is that his Latin is poor. He couldn't write a grammatical Latin sentence to save his life. So the consensus is Patrick, he might be a nice guy, but he's not very bright. And what I want to do is I want to show you something else about Patrick, that I'm not sure if he was a nice guy or not, but he certainly was a writer of extraordinary ability. What he does in those two texts these are works of genius. So what you've got on that handout is what's called Patrick's confessio, his confession, his defense of his whole life, because he suffered attacks as being someone who shouldn't be doing what he's doing because he is unsuitable and he's incapable of doing the job properly. So this was his response to this development, or to this attack. And the other is Patrick's letter, which he sent to a British chieftain called Caitríona. And Caitríona had sailed across the Irish Sea, captured some of Patrick's converts, and brought them off to Britain to be slaves. And this is Patrick's reply to Caitríona. He pulls no punches. So I'll just see if I can move this forward. Okay, so what you're looking at here is our world as we imagine it even today. This is the world as it existed at the beginning of the Christian era. The white part, from these people's point of view, the white part is the good part, the black part is the bad part. Okay, so if you're in any of the black sections of this map, the empire didn't conquer your territories, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't think it was worth their while. Okay, and furthermore, when you're looking at this map in Patrick's time, this is a map not just of the Roman world, this is a map of the Christian world. So that's part of Patrick's identity. Patrick, he talks about himself being British because that's what he was. He came from Britain. He talks about himself being Roman because he's part of that imperial world. And if you look in the handout and you go to, I think it's page 10, on page 10 of the handout, and you look at line 111, when he's writing to Caitríona, he says, "For Caitríona and his merry band, for them, it is a matter of disdain that we be Irish." And the Latin is much stronger. Indignus, it's disgraceful that we're Irish and we're presuming to be Christian at the same time. Because if you're Christian, you're civilized, you're part of the empire, which the Irish obviously weren't. But the really important thing about that particular line is this is the first time in literature that anybody ever wrote about themselves as being Irish. So this is the first literary expression of Irish identity. So the first person to call themselves Irish in literature was British. And there's some sort of, there's some poetic justice. There's some poetic justice in that. And this is a vast empire. Even in the 5th century, it still is a force, but its borders are extraordinarily porous. There are people coming from the barbarian lands, capturing people and making off of them back to their own territories as slaves. This was a daily occurrence. But we have just one written account of that event, of that happening in somebody's life, and that's Patrick. Those are the works of Patrick. That's how we imagine the world now. This is how Patrick and people at his time imagined the world. This is how it looked. And if anybody can find Ireland on that map, they will get a nice, depending what they like, a nice chilled glass of champagne or a nice pint of Murphy's, or a nice pint, but again, nice pint of Guinness. This is how they imagine the world. You've got the great landmass of Europe, Africa, Asia, here described in the Bible, and surrounding it is this all-encircling ocean, with at the very edge of the world, that island of Britain, and beyond Britain, that's the island of Ireland. So remote that it is literally off the map. Beyond it, you've got the island of Dhúill. Nobody lived there, they believed, so it doesn't really figure in any of this. And at the center, you've got Jerusalem. So this is a map not just of space, this is also a map of time, because that's how they understood the world and the way the world was the unfolding of the history of the world. And the unfolding of the history of the world didn't happen by chance. People in the ancient world believe that everything that happens because it's part of a grand plan designed by God. So for these people, history is not so much history as we would understand it. It's sacred history. I think in German you would call it Heilige Geschichte. And the idea is that history starts in the center, and it's a history of salvation. Salvation starts in the center, and the whole dynamic of history is that it is on a course to spread from the center right across the world. Okay, and that's how they understood history. You know, Moses brought salvation to the Israelites in the Old Testament. He provided a pattern for all of history, and history was the gradual working out of the consequences of that, spreading from Jerusalem in the center to the ends of the earth. Okay. The crossover in terms of imperial Rome to Christian Rome and the emergence of the Christian empire is very much focused on the reign of Constantine, the Emperor Constantine I. What emperors would do when they managed to, become emperor by cutting the throat of all of their opposition, or because they were divinely selected by God, you tick the appropriate box, whichever appeals to you. What they would do is the people who supported them, they would give them a nice gift, and that gift was a big gold medallion. And what you're looking at here are two gold medallions from the reign of Constantine I, the first Christian emperor, and his successor Constantine II. And these are medallions from the Roman world, obviously, but also from the Germanic world. These were minted in Trier, in the imperial mint in Trier from the 4th century. They were discovered in a 4th century archaeological context, and the place where they were discovered is also significant, because this is where they were found. You might have heard of a place called Newgrange in County Meath, a great megalithic monument built 5,300 years ago. So even in the 4th century, this was very ancient, but its power was still being felt because these objects were put at the entrance. There's a chamber at the center of that monument. There's a passageway from the outside to the center. These gold medallions were found in a 4th century archaeological context at the entrance, at that passageway into the center. They were minted in the 4th century. They were put there in the 4th century. And what they illustrate is, Ireland might be geographically on the edges, but it's in contact in the 4th century and in the 5th century with the Roman world and also with the Germanic world. These coins came originally from Trier. I'm not sure why I'm showing this. I think it's just because it's a nice picture. Okay, so this is the start of, this is the earliest example of literature written on the island of Ireland. And this is how Patrick's Confessio begins. What Patrick has done is he has journeyed across the borders. He's journeyed through the waters. He's come to Ireland and he's attempted to convert the Irish to Christianity. And the problem with that is, from these people's perspectives, the Christian world was the Roman world. The Roman world was the empire was divinely preordained. And to be part of it, you have to be a Christian, you have to be a Roman. You have to be part of that empire. And Patrick is presuming to make Christians of the Irish. And the Irish had never been part of the Roman world. That's why he got into trouble. This is why he wrote this as a defense of his work. And it starts out, I am Patrick, a sinner, most unlearned, rusticissimus, completely uncouth, not just unlearned. He says, the least of all the faithful and utterly despised by many. Now, this is this is the most uninspiring of uninspiring starts to a biography. But it would be worth your while persisting, because what emerges out of the story is something extraordinary. He says, my father was Calpurnius, a deacon, son of Potitus, a priest. So Patrick tells us straight away that he is part of an ecclesiastical dynasty. His father was a deacon, his grandfather was a priest, was a Christian priest. Section 2 there, he says, I was then about 16 years of age. I did not know the true God, which is an extraordinary admission to make. You're the son of a deacon, the grandson of a priest, and you don't know who God is. I was taken into captivity to Ireland with so many thousands of people, and deservedly so, because we turned away from God and did not keep his commandments. So what happens to Patrick is he is captured when he's living in Britain as a Romano-Briton, someone who is British and part of the Roman Empire. Irish pirates make their way across the Irish Sea, raid his territory, capture Patrick, and bring him back to Ireland, and they make him into a slave. And because of Patrick's understanding of history and the role of providence, this didn't happen by accident. This was punishment for not knowing the true God. So before I begin to look at Patrick's account of his life, what I'll say is it's easy to dismiss it as fiction. This is something that is his rationalization of his life. So before I begin to look at his life, I want to show you how elements of what Patrick says about the people he encountered, the culture and the society he encountered in Ireland reflects reality. So we do have to give Patrick the benefit of the doubt that what he is describing occurred. So if you look at, this is on page 6 of that very long handout you were given, he challenges the status quo. He talks about himself meeting Irish women. He says, among others, a blessed Irish woman of noble birth, beautiful, full-grown, whom I had baptized, came to us after some days for a particular reason. She told us that she received a message from a messenger of God, and he admonished her to be a virgin of Christ, a nun, a cleric. So she gets this message to become a cleric and draw near to God. Thanks be to God, on the 6th day after this, she most laudably and eagerly chose what virgins of Christ do. Not that their fathers agree with them. No, they often suffer persecution and undeserved reproaches from their parents, and yet their number is increasing. Now that gives a fascinating insight into contemporary society, because these women would have been, especially high-born women, they would be expected to form a marriage alliance with someone of equal status. And once a woman in ancient Ireland went into a marriage, she was given what's called a cuithca, meaning a bride wealth. So her husband would give over property for her, and that property didn't go to her, it went to her family. So there would have been intense pressure on these women to marry from their own family because their own family stood to gain. What happens over the centuries is women get a slice of that property, and that amount of property grows as you move through time, because the laws become highly critical of women who don't give their fathers anything of their bride price. So that, the fact that they would punish this shows that it is a development. So in that sense, Patrick is reflecting this. He is telling us about the society he's working in, that the society he has to negotiate his way through. And this story of women being forced into marriage crops up in Patrick's own biographies, the biographies written about him in the 7th century, at the end of the 7th century. It crops up in the life of St. Bridget. The greatest of all the Irish female saints is herself pressured into a marriage. She's pursued by a figure who's important for Irish legal history. His name is Dhúill mac Lugar. And he goes and he asks Bridget to marry him, and Bridget says, no, forget it. And he doesn't take no for an answer until eventually Bridget says, look, you go over the hill, you find a house, there's a girl in there who will marry you. And eventually he gets the message. But in some accounts of his life, Bridget has to go a step further. He doesn't stop. So what Bridget does is she sticks her thumb into her eye, pulls her out her eye, and her eye hangs on the cheek, on her face. And I think Dhúill gets the message. This is enough of a turn off, and he goes away. So Bridget takes her eye, puts it back, pops it back in, and everything is okay. But what these stories really illustrate is, it shows that this is a society in which status matters, and families' status matter. And the alliance formed between families, in that nexus between dynasties and prominent families, women have an essential role to play. And that is their predetermined role in life. There's no way out. This is what they have to do. This is what they were born to do. They were born to marry and produce more children. But what Patrick is doing here is he's offering a way out of that life. So Patrick is coming and he is challenging that order. And what Patrick writes here is a reflection of that reality. He goes on and he says, how many have been reborn in Ireland there so as to be of our kind, I do not know. He talks about these people being reborn. When you are born, you are given a biological identity over which you have absolutely no control. You don't choose your family, you don't choose your parents, you don't choose your siblings, you don't choose your social status, you're born into it. But what Patrick seems to be looking at here is an identity which transcends that through rebirth. Now, this rebirth can be ritualized in a Christian context, and I'll get to that later on. If you look down at section 49, just after that, he says, but the greatest is the suffering of those women who live in slavery. So he's interested with highborn women, and also women of the most vulnerable of all in this society would be women who were slaves. And he also addresses himself to them. If you look at, see on page 7, he says, for although I be rude in all things, nevertheless, I have tried tried somehow to keep myself safe. And that too for my Christian brethren, and the virgins of Christ, and the pious women who of their own accord made me gifts and laid on the altar some of their ornaments, and I gave them back to them, and they were offended that I did so. But I did it for the hope of lasting success, in order to preserve myself cautiously in everything, so that they might not seize upon me or my ministry of service under the pretext of dishonesty. So he's describing here these women who come into his church and they put offerings on the altar, and he protects himself from the charge of, lining his own pockets. He insists that they take them back. Now think back to Newgrange. Think back to those offerings of those gold medallions, those donativa that were probably put there by people making an offering to the gods by giving them precious objects. So what we saw in that slide in Newgrange, this is what Patrick is describing in his own life. So he's describing the reality of the world in which he lives. So he must be given, at least he must be given the courtesy of a fair hearing. So before we begin to look at what Patrick says about himself, just to say, I've put in some extracts there from biblical extracts, Paul's letter to the Colossians, when he's talking about Christian identity, which transcends these divisions of ethnicity, which transcends these divisions of gender, which transcends divisions of class. He says here, there cannot be Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free man. Same thing in Galatians, he says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So what Patrick is doing is he's bringing in this identity, which doesn't depend on social class. It doesn't depend on ethnicity. It's an identity which transcends these and in effect subverts these biological, an identity which is biologically determined. Okay. So what I'll do is try to reconstruct what Patrick says about his life. So this is where Patrick becomes extraordinarily inventive when he describes the journey quite literally of his life, because his life is determined by a crucial journey that he makes. And that journey is really the key to understanding his what he's attempting to do in what he writes. So he says, we've already looked at this. He says that he is born from an ecclesiastical dynasty. He doesn't know God. He's captured by Irish pirates as a punishment, and he ends up as a slave in a foreign land. Then he goes on and he says, after he is a slave in Ireland for a period of 6, maybe 7 years, and those numbers are important, he says, after that period, he says, and there one night I heard in my sleep a voice saying to me, "It is well that you fast. Soon you will go to your own country." And again, after a short while, I heard a voice saying to me, "See, your ship is ready." And it was not near, but at a distance of perhaps 200 miles. And I had never been there, nor did I know a living soul there. And then I took flight and left the man with whom I had stayed for 6 years, and I went in the strength of God, who directed my way to my good, and I feared nothing till I came to that ship. So the next stage he describes in his life is how he is given divine instruction in how to escape from his slavery. He then goes on and he says, and after 3 days we reached land. So he gets in the ship, he journeys across the waters, and he journeys on and that journey lasts for 3 days. Everything that he writes, there are no gratuitous details in here. Everything that he writes is loaded with significance. After 3 days, we reached land. And for 28 days, we traveled through deserted country. And he says the people traveling with me lacked food, and hunger overcame them. And the next day, the captain said to me, "Tell me, Christian, you say that your God is great and all-powerful. Why then do you not pray for us? As you can see, we are suffering from hunger. It is unlikely indeed that we shall ever see another human being again." So he escapes through the waters. He then wanders through the desert, and they're starving. The people he's traveling with are starving. And in section 23 there, if you read it at your convenience, they come across a herd of unfortunate pigs, and they're miraculously, he believes, provided with food. Then he describes himself returning to Ireland after he had escaped. These details that you see here in what Patrick writes, they follow a pattern, the story of his journey, the outlines of his life. He's born a Romano-British Christian. He disobeys his elders. He's captured, enslaved in Ireland. He receives divine instruction in how to escape. He escapes through the waters on a journey of 3 days. And after that journey, they're shipwrecked. They're in deserted land, and they wander through that deserted land for 28 days. And on that journey, they're miraculously provided with food. So that's what he says about his life. That's what he says about his escape, the journey of his escape. And I just wondered, does this pattern strike any similarities? Does anybody see any could anybody volunteer an opinion as to whether you've seen this pattern at work before, or does it ring any bells? Disobey God, punished by being made into a slave in a foreign land.
I think it sounds pretty much like Jesus Christ.
Okay, it does, absolutely, it does. That's part of the pattern. But I'm just thinking of an early. So if you're thinking about a biblical pattern, you're absolutely right. I'm just trying to think. Can you identify an earlier biblical example that Patrick might have in mind, Frederick?
It sounds a bit like Odysseus.
Sorry.
It sounds a bit like Odysseus.
I'm not sure.
I don't know how to pronounce in English.
Ulysses.
Actually, that is a comment that has been made, because these journeys are which occur at the founding of nations and the founding of identities, it's a very common theme. So you're not the first to see that, but what I'm thinking is something biblical, which would sort of correspond to Patrick's view. Any other guesses? Marcel?
I think it refers to Moses.
Yeah. Okay. So you get the chilled glass of champagne, but I should stress it's an imaginary chilled glass of champagne. Yes. So what Patrick is doing here is he is deliberately presenting the outline of his life to conform to a biblical pattern. You know, so when you read Patrick, you just think, you know, this is long. Has anybody ever heard of Frank McCourt? Angela's Ashes. Has anybody ever read that? You know, it's a story of an Irish childhood, which is unrelentingly bleak beyond belief, literally bleak beyond belief. And when you're reading Patrick, it's like reading Frank McCourt on speed. Frank McCourt on speed on steroids, because he talks about his life being so difficult, and he talks about his life as being unrelentingly challenging. But what he's doing here is he doesn't say straight out, I'm like Moses. He does it very implicitly. So in the Old Testament, the Israelites, they're the chosen people. They've got the Torah. They know it's what. They know what the law is, but they don't follow it. And they are divinely chastised by being, for their disregard for God, by being made into slaves in Egypt. The next step, Moses receives divine instruction for escape, exactly as Patrick did, divine instruction for escape. The Israelites escape across the Red Sea. Patrick escapes also on a journey through the waters. The Israelites wander through the desert for 40 years. Patrick wanders through the desert for 28 days. I wonder, can anybody suggest the correlation there? You know, 40 years wandering through the desert, 40 years, 4 decades. Patrick wandering through the desert, 28 days, 4 weeks. The Israelites are miraculously provided with manna from heaven. Patrick and his followers are also miraculously provided with food. So what Patrick is doing here in giving his account of his life is he's being inventive, as we would see it, but he's also presenting his life as following that predetermined, divinely predetermined, providential pattern. And what he's doing is, you know, when you read about Patrick as being unlearned, as being stupid, as being unlettered, don't believe it for a moment. What Patrick is attempting to do here is he is attempting to present himself as the fulfiller of biblical prophecy. You know, what started at the center here with Moses, Patrick as the new Moses is bringing to completion at the very edges, at the furthest possible geographic remove from the center. You can't get further from Jerusalem than Ireland, according to this map. So if it begins in Jerusalem, it must end in Ireland. And what Patrick is doing is he's saying, I am bringing to completion what Moses started at the center. I, as the second Moses, am completing at the edges. He's not just the second Moses, he's better than Moses. If you look at some of the what I put on the handout, some extracts from the Old Testament that you see here. Therefore glorify ye the Lord in instruction, the name of the Lord God of Israel in the islands of the sea, in the islands of the sea. So it's the idea that God will be glorified, not just at the center, but in the sea, at the islands. If there are islands in the sea, they are distant. They're at the ends of the earth. He said, the second extract, and I will set a sign among them, and I will send them that shall be saved to the Gentiles into the sea, into Africa and Lydia, them that draw the bow. If you draw the bow, you're a barbarian, you're a hunter. Into Italy and Greece, and to the islands afar off. Okay. And if you read what Patrick writes about himself and his experience, if you look at the very end of that first paragraph there, so we have seen it, and so it has been fulfilled. Indeed, we are witnesses that the gospel has been preached under those parts beyond which there lives nobody. And if you look at the next extract, there are references to the utmost parts of the earth, the ends of the earth, the utmost part of the earth. So when you read Patrick's references to his specific geographic location at the ends of the earth, this is all part of his telling of a story. And he tells that story in a wonderfully inventive way. You know, when you read what he writes, it sort of, you know, it does lock you out because it's rebarbative to a modern reader. But once you give him the benefit of the doubt and you apply yourself, Patrick emerges as a writer of extraordinary sophistication. And what he does is he marks the beginning of Ireland's literary tradition. So this is what the literary tradition of Ireland, this is its starting point. This is what it grows out of. So he talks about the fact that his journey of escape, so he's captured, he's been given divine instruction how to escape. He's told his ship is waiting for him 200 miles away. He journeys to the ship, he jumps ship, he sails across the water, and he gives another detail there. He says, it took him 3 days. And he gives that detail. It's not a gratuitous detail. You know, it's put in there for a purpose. And for contemporaries who would have read this, they would have seen immediately what Patrick is attempting to do as part of his defense. Because when you think of who else journeyed across the waves involuntarily for 3 days, any guesses? You've got a visual hint here. This is a sarcophagus. This is a sarcophagus in the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome. It's 3rd century. You might see. This is the hint. This fellow looking rather comfortable, but he shouldn't be too comfortable because there's this sea monster about to devour him. So this is the story of Jonah and the whale. So Jonah is a figure in the Old Testament, and according to the story, he's swallowed by a whale, and he spends 3 days in the belly of the whale before he's vomited up again. And for Christians, this had a deep symbolism because this was seen as a mystical prefiguration of Christ's death and resurrection to a new life. So Christ is crucified. He spends 3 days in the tomb, and after that, he is reborn. And that, for all Christians, obviously had a deep significance, but it was recalled at an event in all of their lives when they moved from their biological birth, which established their social identity, to a new rebirth through baptism, which established their spiritual identity. Because they would have been dunked under the water for three times, immersed in water 3 times, recalling Jonah's journey through the waters of salvation on his 3-day journey. Christ's baptism is shown here on the other side. And what Patrick's attempting to do when he puts in that little detail of the fact that his journey took him 3 days is he is giving an account of his own spiritual rebirth. But this is a story that applies not just to him, it's the rebirth of the Irish people, the rebirth of the Irish people as a new people. Okay, so what Patrick does in that very short letter is he packs a lot in there. And what he does is he establishes a new identity for a people. You know, and I think, you know, Irish people were slow to appreciate Patrick. If you look at literature from the beginning of the 7th century in Ireland, Patrick doesn't figure at all. He barely figures. You know, I think, you know, many Irish writers, they may have been extraordinarily inventive, but they were slow learners. They were slow learners to see the genius of Patrick in the details that he presents in his telling of the story of his life and his journey in search of an identity for the people he's coming into contact with.
Okay, I think we should stop here now just to allow maybe some questions. But thank you very much, first of all, for these fascinating insights. and the intriguing talk where I again learned a lot, and probably all the others as well. And yes, I think we cannot really get into a huge discussion, but maybe if you have questions. Just the applause, but no yellow hands wanting to know anything. Okay, I have a brief question. You said one sentence which I found interesting. Christian world was the Roman world, right? This is what you said.
Mm-hmm.
But in the very beginning, actually the Romans persecuted the Christians, and they eventually converted in stages, as far as I know. I'm not a historian. This is a real question. So when would you say that the Christian world was actually Roman world, or the other way around?
From a Christian perspective, it always was Christian, even because for Christians, they had the same providential view that Patrick has, that the empire was brought into being because it was divinely preordained that it would come into being. So the empire is started by the Emperor Augustus, the first emperor, and in Augustus's reign, Christ was born. And for early Christians, this was more than a coincidence. This was part of that divine plan. The church, Christianity and the empire have their same, they begin at the same point in history. And that happens as a reason, because the empire is going to be the sort of cocoon into which the Christian world would grow and develop. Okay, and that's how they rationalize their past. So Christianity depended on that empire. What happens in the 5th century is that empire collapses. So what's going on? Were they wrong all along? And that's where the Irish come in. Because at precisely the moment that the empire collapses, the Irish become Christian. So they're able to say the collapse of the empire is also part of the divinely preordained plan, because Christian Rome has superseded imperial Rome. It's outlasted it, but also it's reached a part of the world that was never part of the empire, Ireland. So what Patrick does is also deeply subversive. To be, the idea is that the empire is made, the empire expands, it civilizes, and then along come missionaries who convert. So the empire conquers a people, it slaps some manners on them, and then they can be converted to Christianity. But that's not what Patrick is doing. Patrick is going to Ireland, which was never part of the empire, and he's making them Christians. So this was deeply challenging, because their identity as Romans and their identity as Christians went together. But Patrick was presenting a case where that wasn't you could go from being a barbarian to being a Christian without going through the essential preparatory stage of being civilized. And he's aware of that. And Patrick describes in his life, he says, he reveals, it's very revealing what he says. He says, they brought a case against me because they found out, he says, what I did when I was a boy, 15, maybe 16 years old, in the space, he says, in the space of an hour, I committed the sin. Now, what that sin is anybody's guess. There are all sorts of theories, but Patrick reveals it. He reveals that they are out to get him. And people have concentrated on Patrick's shortcomings as reasons why he would need to defend himself. But I think the real reason why he needed to defend himself is because what he was doing was subverting the status quo. He was challenging the status quo in Ireland, of course, but also the status quo in the world which he was emerging from.
Yeah, so that's the way history is written.
By them, that's how it was written. Our view is somewhat different.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for this answer. Ina, is it okay if we have a final question by Antonius? Okay, Antonius.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to thank you for the talk. And this question might not really lead somewhere. It was just a little thought that the whale parable sparked, because we have Patrick creating this kind of parallel with the 3 days journey to being trapped inside the whale's body. And you just told us that the Irish didn't really, or rather it took a long time until they really accepted Patrick and that they built upon what he created, so to say. And I was just wondering, can we maybe in some way retrace, for example, the voyage of St. Brendan, where we also have a whale featuring? Can we maybe retrace it to Patrick, or should we just create the parallel that it are just back to the Bible itself?
That's a very good question. I don't know if I can answer it because, you know, journeys are important in literature, and journeys are important as the most obvious way of cultural contact. For Patrick, the journey was essential to his identity, just as the journey of St. Brendan was essential to his identity, and just as the journey of Columbanus, who evangelized, well, who pursued his mission on the continent, was very important to his journey as well, in a practical sense, but also as a symbolic sense. You might have noticed that Patrick draws attention to his social background in what he writes. He says, "I am freeborn by descent." He says that about 3 or 4 times, if not more. And he draws attention to the social status of his converts. They're also people, he says, these are the sons and daughters of the kings of the Irish. So in that sense, you know, some scholars have written about Patrick as being something of a snob. You know, he reminds you of his own social background, and he converted only the nicest people. But what Patrick is doing is, when he journeys away from his family, in that journey from Britain to Ireland, he's rejecting that idea that he somehow is the product of a social background, that he might be born, he might be freeborn, but he says this is a value put on me by society, and he rejects it. So the whole idea of journeying away from the family is a rejection of the material. It's a rejection of the mundane in the quest for the transcendent. So journeys are important because they're part of a quest. They're a rejection of what you're journeying away from: your family, your wealth, your status. And he talks about this constantly. That's what Patrick is rejecting in journeying towards the unknown, a part of the world where he you know, in Patrick's world, if you walk 10 kilometers down the road from your front door, you're a foreigner. Nobody knows who you are. So it's a dangerous thing to do. It's a dangerous thing to do because you have no protections. And when Patrick is throwing himself upon fate, that's what he's doing in that journey. That's also what Columbanus does afterwards. It's what Patrick does is he establishes a key element of Irish identity, early Irish Christian identity, and it's an asceticism which is, you could say, rigorous, or some might say fanatical. You know, it's all or nothing, and that really comes that really comes through in the literature of this period. We can't really talk anymore about Celtic Christianity, because if you do, well, okay. But the fact is, when you're looking at these sources, there is an undeniable difference in emphasis, and that rigorous asceticism of these early Irish writers is what defines them, and it's there from the time of St. Patrick. So when you're looking at St. Brendan and his voyage in the quest for the transcendent, this relates, I think, in a very direct way to what Patrick is doing in his account of his own journey. It's a journey of self-discovery, and it's also a journey in search of the transcendent, which implies a rejection of the mundane.
Thank you very much, Damian, for this detailed answer. And again, thank you for the great talk, which we all enjoyed very much. Yeah, I pass on the word to Ina, because we do not have a break now, but after the next talk.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria and Damian. The next session will be a session on uncomfortable legacies, Irish-German parallels, and our expert for that session is Caitríona Dhúill, and I hope I pronounced that somewhat close to how it should be pronounced. She's professor in German at the School of Languages and Literatures and Cultures at University College Cork. Her research areas are German, Austrian, and comparative literature from the late 19th century to the present day. Her publications include 2 books, 2 monographs, Sex in Imagined Spaces, Gender and Utopia from Moore to Bloch, which was published in 2010, and most recently, Metabiography, Reflecting on Biography, which was published by Palgrave in 2020. She co-edited a special issue of the journal Poetics Today on negative and dystopian futures in 2016, and is currently working on a co-edited volume entitled Anthropocene Austria. She edits the journal Austrian Studies, founded the Center for Cultural Ecology at Durham University in 2017, and the Irish network Humanities for the Anthropocene in May 2021. And as mentioned before, we're very happy to have her here today, and her session is entitled Uncomfortable Legacies, Irish-German Parallels. And I hand over to you, Caitríona.
Many thanks, Ina. Can everybody hear me okay? Just maybe, yeah, okay. I'm seeing some nods there. That's great. I'm going to start screen sharing. And as Ina Bergmann has kindly done the introduction and reminded you of my title, I can skip the first slide immediately with the Uncomfortable Legacies, Irish-German Parallels. And I think you've already had this outline in addition to the reading that I hope that you've had a chance to look at in advance, because the two texts we're looking at are Derek Scali's book, The Best Catholics in the World, published this year, 2021. And we're going to be reading it together with a memoir from 2003 by the Irish-German author Hugo Hamilton. So I thought I'd start with this image. I hope everybody can see that okay. Can you see it? Yeah. Could I ask any of the...
Yes,
no, I'm not going to...
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. I was going to put some of my own students on the spot there. But basically, and those of us who live in Cork see this building a lot. So I see it on my way to work every day. This building, I show you this image because the building sort of encapsulates what Derek Scali is talking about. It's the built legacy of the history that he's dealing with in his book, The Best Catholics in the World. This is the Good Shepherd Convent, or I should say the former Good Shepherd Convent, in which the Good Shepherd sisters ran an orphanage and a Magdalene laundry. And they sold this building to our institution in 1995. And since then, it has become increasingly derelict, and it has changed ownership several times. And at the height of the property boom, the Celtic Tiger, in around 2006, it changed hands for the sum of 20 million euros. But it's been damaged by fire, and it's currently not clear exactly what's going to happen with it. There are plans to turn it into apartment blocks. So this and other similar buildings dot the landscape of Irish cities, towns, and the countryside. And what Derek Scali's book is trying to do is come to terms with what was happening inside the walls of some of these buildings throughout the 20th century, since the founding of the Irish state. And this is a very uncomfortable chapter in Ireland's history, and it's a difficult legacy, and it's one that's shrouded by shame, difficult emotions, anger, and silence. And so Scali's book is one of several that have come out in recent years that are really trying to open up the conversation about where we go next with this legacy. Okay, so Scali charts a dramatic change in less than 4 decades, which I think many of us have lived through, and we're still living through the sort of aftermath and the way in which this change is washing through Irish culture and society. And one way to visualize this is by placing these two images side by side. This may remind you of the coverage of Trump and Obama's respective inaugurations, where we saw the avenue in Washington, D.C., where people lined out in huge numbers to celebrate Obama's inauguration. And then they were rained off, as Trump said, although he still maintained that it was an enormous crowd. Now, there's a longer gap separating these two images, but what these show is a public mass held by the Pope, the respective Pope, on his visit to Ireland. And it's held in the Phoenix Park, which is one of the largest urban parks in Europe. And at the time when Pope John Paul II came to Ireland in 1979, 1 million mass goers gathered there. And in fact, of that million, that was just not a fraction, but that was less than half of the total number of people in Ireland who turned out to see the Pope in 1979. So there's an estimate that 2.7 million, which in a population of around 4 million at the time, is well over half, so well over 50% of the Irish population actually physically turned out to see the Pope. I fall into the generation like Derek Scally of people who was old enough to have been alive at this time, but too young to have actually gone, although I do remember it, unlike Scally, who was only 2 at the time. And then you see juxtaposed with that image, much more recent image of Pope Francis's visit in 2018, where the numbers have dropped by 85%. So now you have an estimated 130,000 mass goers at the Phoenix Park in the space of less than 4 decades. That gives you some sense of the word seismic is often used, the seismic changes that have overcome Catholic Ireland. And we could reference many more sort of examples of this. And what I'd like to do, I'll just stop the share for a minute so that we can get to know Scally a little bit better. And I'd like to actually read a passage from Scally. I think this is a combination. Scally is a journalist, and I'll say a little bit more about his biography in a moment. But the way in which he writes this book is deeply personal. It is a work of journalistic inquiry, and it's also an attempt to come to terms with a recent chapter in Ireland's past. But at the same time, he is a deeply inquisitive writer who enters into dialogue. I find him very dialogic, and I like the way in which he's constantly striking up conversations, visiting people, recording interviews, and he weaves all of these conversations into his book, The Best Catholics in the World. And of course, the book itself is looking in 2 directions culturally, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So one of the conversations I'd like to pick out, and if you have the text in front of you, you might like to follow along as I read this, or simply listen. Sometimes it's nice when it's a written record of spoken conversation to hear it transmuted back into oral delivery. So I'll try to be Sister Deirdre and Derek as they have their conversation on the quays in 2018. So they're on their way to the Phoenix Park to see the second Pope, or rather Pope Francis, visiting. Sister Deirdre is a nun who he runs into, and the first thing he says is that he calls her an anachronism. She's a nun about his age. And so straight away, we feel that history is out of joint here in some way. And they're both returning emigrants. So people who've been away from Ireland for 2 decades and who've now come back on a visit on the occasion of the papal visit. Now that she's back, what does she make of the mood? There's a real anger, she says. The anger comes from a continued failure by Ireland's Catholic Church to address fully the clerical child sexual abuse scandal, she says. Neighbours in County Roscommon, who used to be very pious, are now giving out yards about the church. And that's another thing that Scally does. He weaves in idiom and the sort of local colour of Hiberno English all the time into his writing. The abuse, the cover-ups, the state collusion, the apologies, the pain, the wasted lives, the broken families. In sum, the agony of grappling today with what was once Catholic Ireland. Then, without a moment's hesitation or any leading questions from me, something pours out of this young sister that she has clearly been reflecting on for some time. There is anger, she repeats, but I sense it is an old anger. Some of the anger directed outward, she thinks, is from people who are unable to rid themselves of an inner rage that had been building in themselves as something inherited from famine or penal times, or perhaps even earlier. People put the priests and bishops on a pedestal, and they are angry now at themselves for doing it, she says. The current younger generation is taking them down, but the anger at the past remains. But when I look at the crowd passing me, papal mass-goers and apathetic Dubliners out for some Sunday shopping, no one looks angry. Can you be both angry and apathetic, I wonder, or angry yet calm? On my way here this morning, I have been struck many times by the easy, gentle demeanour of the mass-going crowd. I felt it when we crammed into the Lewis tram, the city centre to today's last stop, Smithfield. The driver, aware of the trudge down the quays ahead of us, told the passengers apologetically, I can get you no closer to the Pope. Everyone chuckled as they disembarked. Like the sing-song voices of the street traders, this softer spirit is part of the atmosphere of my childhood. something that I didn't notice disappearing. Now, you may have been struck in that passage by the way in which the youngish nun refers to the famine or penal times. And without going into too much in the way of historical background, which is something which Scully does in the rest of the book, it's worth noting that the famine generation at the time at which Scully writes this book is roughly 7 generations prior to where we are today. Okay, so that the generation of Irish people who experienced the Great Hunger and the famine of the 1840s is 7 generations back from where we are. And I'll come back to that 7-generation time span in a while, but it's one that you may be familiar with. It's one that comes up quite a lot in decolonial thinking and in indigenous epistemology as being the span of time with which we need to be reckoning as having consequences of actions that are carried out today. But it's a span of time that's very difficult to imagine and connect with, especially if you are the last in the chain of 7 generations. It's easier to think back 3 and forward 3. It's very difficult to feel a sense of continuity across 7. So I'll start sharing again. Okay, so that was our image of the Phoenix Park then and now. Now I mentioned the overall topic of the book, and you have got a sense of it from the excerpts that I've set for reading today. But it's worth noting that the Magdalen Laundry, of which I showed you a picture, and there were many such dotted about Ireland, and some of them didn't close until the 1990s. We're only one arm of the system of institutional abuse and incarceration that was in place in Catholic Ireland from the founding of the state up, as I say, until for most of the 20th century. So along with the Magdalen Laundries, there were also mother and baby homes, most infamously in Tuam. And there were also a system of industrial schools and other church-run residential settings in which vulnerable young people and children were held or were resident, but were very much at risk from any abusive tendencies of the clergy in whose charge they were. And this more intramural, we could say, or institutional abuse was taking place in a wider social context in which there was also abuse in parishes, in families, in the sacristies. There were famous cases of altar servers, for example, young altar boys being abused by the priest and so on. And so this all came washing out. It was almost like for those of us who can remember it, it was like as if the dam had burst. One of the first was the Father Brendan Smith case, which Derek Scally mentions in this chapter. Which was first reported in the early 90s. And from that point onwards, at some time it felt like almost daily there were reports of clerical abuse, and there were then RTE documentaries and memoirs being published by survivors of abuse and so on. And then the survivors were organizing themselves into lobby groups, and this has become a huge political and social issue in Ireland that continues on until today, and which we cannot say has been resolved. So while he's telling this as a story, most of which happened in the past, he's also concerned with the living legacy of this and its aftermath, which is very real and unresolved, particularly for the survivors, but he's arguing for all of Irish society. And he mentions also key dates of the Ryan Report and the Murphy Report, both of which were 2009. So these were reports that were commissioned by the government into these matters. Now, I'm fascinated, being more of a literature than a history person, so I'm fascinated with aesthetic form and language and how you tell a story. And I would love to ask Derek Scally one day why he chose the image for the cover, and maybe if any of you have ideas about that, or I'd love to hear from you as to how this image resonated with you. So it's this colour photograph from the 1980s of a May parade. So we might come back to that in the discussion. But I'll move on for now and talk about how Scally is reckoning with the Irish Catholic past, but he's doing so from an intercultural perspective. So Scally himself is a long-time resident in Berlin. He's lived there for 20 years, and he's the Germany correspondent for the main Irish, or one of the main Irish daily broadsheets, the Irish Times. So he has an extensive familiarity with German culture. And so he's, and I'll come to the parallels in a minute because they are in some ways problematic, but in ways which he acknowledges, and he anticipates objections that could be raised about drawing such a parallel. What he's particularly concerned to do in this book is to go beyond the very important legislative questions around justice and redress. So what's happening about compensation for the survivors of abuse? You know, to what extent are the religious orders held accountable? What's happening with compensation and so on. So these are still live issues which are to some extent still going through the courts and being queried. And there are various redress schemes, but these are criticized as being inadequate or not evenly not distributed in an equitable way among the survivors of abuse. But Scally, while he acknowledges that context of legislation and redress, he wants to go beyond this to this wider psychosocial implications of complicity and amnesia, and the question of how to remember and confront the Irish Catholic past. As someone who grew up within that majority culture, himself an Irish Catholic, he calls himself now a grappling Catholic. But he asks repeatedly throughout the book questions along the lines of, this is how he says it on page 4, but he keeps coming back to this question: why, I wonder, did we as a nation let the Catholic Church dominate this land for most of the 20th century? And in his conversations with Yvonne Murphy, I think it is, with one of the people who's responsible for one of the major reports into this, he keeps coming back to this idea of undue deference. And this was a concept that was often mentioned in these reports, that the abuse was going on under the cover of a culture of undue deference. And again, Sister Deirdre, in the quote we've just read, talks about this as being the practice of putting the priests and bishops up on a pedestal. So Scally's interested in the cultural roots of this attitude. So why is it that Ireland in particular, and of course we know from other contexts, be it the United States, Canada, Italy, wherever, you know, Ireland doesn't have a monopoly on institutional clerical abuse or systematic abuse of clerical power in this way. And yet it seems to have thrived in Ireland in a particularly intense way. And he wants to find out what the cultural roots of this might be. So what was it in the Irish attitude to church authority that allowed this systematic abuse to flourish unhindered? And he uses terms such as toxicity and, in the passage we've just read, agony, to talk about the legacy and the feelings that it evokes. Now, as I said, it's an intercultural study because he's very much positioned as an intercultural writer, and he's looking backward and forth between Ireland and Germany. And he's very cautious when he makes these comparisons. And I'd be really interested in our discussion to hear how these comparisons landed with you, positioned as we are as a group also in this sort of intercultural space. So he's not drawing comparisons between the violence perpetrated in different settings. So it's not a case of saying, as in fact some of the more intemperate language, understandably the intemperate language of some of the abuse survivors, has ended up drawing comparisons, for example, between what was happening behind the walls of these institutions and the Holocaust. And of course, Scally says that that's not helpful. You can't actually do this. You can't draw comparisons between violence perpetrated in different settings, because every act of violence is in fact incomparable, just as human suffering cannot ever be measured or compared on any kind of scale. But where we can learn from a comparative approach that looks back and forth between Ireland and Germany might be in this area of how we relate to and engage with the past and its difficult legacies. So that's just as a way of contextualizing what you may have been struck by as you read this, that there are comparisons between systems. So he makes the old joke that, you know, it's systems are much more orderly and better organized in German culture than in Irish culture. In Irish culture, if we have a system, we tend to sort of ignore it. And, you know, there was a ticketing system. Where would you go? Which gate would you enter the Phoenix Park to attend the papal mass? But actually then they didn't bother with it. And you could go in the red gate even if you had a green ticket. And he sort of laughs at himself because after 20 years in Germany, he's sort of surprised when systems don't work. Then he makes another, perhaps more troubling comparison, which is with Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph des Willens, which was a Nazi propaganda film in which she showed footage of the Nuremberg rallies in the 1930s. But these, you'll see that references to German writers and artists, from Siegfried Lenz to Remarque at the very end of the book, are scattered throughout the text. And this is actually expresses his more his more focused concern on Vergangenheitsbewältigung as a possible frame for how we might deal with our Irish Catholic story. What might it be possible, he says on page 9, to apply some of the principles, sorry, I've misspelled that, it should read principles of German Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And of course, straight away, those of us familiar with the debates in post-war Germany say, well, what does he mean by principles of German Vergangenheitsbewältigung? What are these? And in fact, we know that Vergangenheitsbewältigung isn't a word, it's a word that's used again with caution now, and it has tended to give way to other formulations such as Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, because you can't bewältig, you can't overcome or overpower or master the past in the way that nice big long word suggests. So the process of coming to terms with the past, is this a past we can ever really come to terms with? But certainly, while we cannot be blamed for a past beyond our reach, this does not absolve us of responsibility to try and understand it either. And the other question he asks is, what does it mean to be complicit in a coercive culture? And here, the comparison that he draws, and in the last part of the passage I set you, is with the surveillance regime of the GDR and the fact that there was a massive apparatus of surveillance and control, and that actually many people trying to just live their ordinary lives and keep their heads down in the GDR found themselves somehow complicit with this regime in other ways, even if they weren't fully signed up to its ideology. They wanted to just get by and survive and stay out of trouble, and that in itself would make them complicit with it. And he finds this to be a very illuminating parallel with what was happening in Ireland at the same time. Now, so much on Scally, and so that we'll have time for a discussion at the end, I'd like to now move on to our second text, and to draw attention to the fact that this is also a text set in those middle decades. So Hugo Hamilton, looking back to his childhood, he's looking back to an early 1960s childhood in Dublin, in South Dublin. And so a lot of the period that Scally is concerned with is also the historical period that Hamilton is concerned with too. Hamilton's slightly older, but they're roughly rough contemporaries, and Hamilton is of course still writing, and he writes in both languages. So we'll say more about Hamilton now in a minute. But one of the reasons I wanted to pair these texts together was that Scally's is a text that's very much focused on adult conversations. So conversations between journalists, academics, survivors of abuse, retired clergy, people who lived in these institutions. It's people looking back on their lives, which of course Hamilton's as a memoir is also looking back. But what Hamilton's trying to do is narrate the past from the child's perspective, and to locate the child's experience and to bring it to life again through his literary prose. And what Hamilton's memoir subject, so the narrator of this, who is Hamilton, so it is an autobiographical narrator, so we can say Hamilton is narrating his own childhood, but he's trying to get back inside his child's perspective. He narrates his own situation caught between maternal German refuge. I've put it like this because his mother seems to be a sort of psychological refuge for him. And he's caught between her and the Gaelic patriarch. And this is then further triangulated through the wider English-speaking context of modern Ireland in the 1960s. So he has a trilingual reality, but his childhood within the family, the official family narrative, is that this is a bilingual childhood. And this creates a huge tension within Hamilton as he tries as a young child to negotiate this trilingual reality, which must always suppress itself and pretend to be officially bilingual. So the Gaelic patriarch, his father was a Gaeilgeoir. Now, a Gaeilgeoir is somebody who speaks Irish fluently and wishes to live their life through Irish, but they don't live in one of the districts in the west of Ireland in which Irish is the everyday language used by the population of that area. Rather, they live in an English-speaking part of Ireland, which is the majority, but they're living their lives through Irish. So this is the idea behind Gaeilgeoir as a sort of category, or as a sociolinguistic category. But what happens in this text is that the political and linguistic aspirations of the Gaeilgeoir get meshed in with patriarchal violence in a way that's can be very difficult to read. So I hope you didn't find those passages too upsetting. I should have given content warnings with some of this material, because particularly the Scally. but we are grappling with some of the some dark chapters of Ireland's past here as well. So perhaps not too surprising, even if upsetting. And what we also have in moments in this are the German mother. So the mother has moved from Germany to Ireland and has married an Irish man, and now they're bringing up their children through German and Irish. And as a German woman living in the post-war period in Ireland, the mother sometimes has very uncomfortable encounters with pro-Hitler sympathies in 1950s and 1960s Ireland. And some of these are narrated in the sections which I set for you. And I suppose the key point that we can take from this, and then we'll move slowly to our discussion, is that any regime, and when I say regime, I mean this in both the broadest possible sense to refer to the various dictatorships or totalitarian regimes that have been the tragedy of human history throughout the 20th century, to the smaller regimes we inhabit day to day within our own families, within our own institutions, within our own lives. So we can use the word regime in quite a pliable way. And if we see the family in Hamilton's The Speckled People as itself a sort of microcosmic regime, and what we see happening in this officially bilingual regime is that any regime, even one that is dedicated to a decolonial or decolonizing agenda, as the father clearly is, has the potential to become violent. And so maybe to bring that to life, we look at maybe two passages before I hand over to you for any questions that you may have. The passage, we may not read the whole passage just for reasons of time, but if you have it there, if you can turn to page 29 to 32, which is coming towards the end of the section that I had set, we have the anecdote concerning the father's punishment of Franz, the narrator's brother, for speaking a little phrase. And all the way through this text, you also have evidence of Hamilton's delight in language and of the child's awakening to the pleasures of language. So when they have, for example, they're playing on there's lots of narratives of games, childhood games. I'm trying to find this page 29. Yeah. So Franz, the younger brother, is supposed to either be speaking Irish or German. Well, this is the official language policy of the family, but he's come across this little phrase, and he's very young. So he's, just almost babbling away. I don't know exactly what age he is at this point, but the youngest sister, Maria, has just been born, and Franz and the narrator are very small children. And he's made a wall with a line of bricks, and he's walking on the wall, going, walk on the wall, and he's singing to himself. And of course, what strikes you about the phrase walk on the wall? It contains this alliteration of the w and the w. So this is a child's pleasure in language, the discovery that language has a sort of sensuous quality to it. But this inspires the rage of the father. And in fact, what then happens is the father pushes him off the wall, and Franz, as he falls to the ground, falls on a brick, and his nose is broken. And this leads the mother to try to leave the father, but then it doesn't work out, and she ends up staying behind. Now, what's happening here, and I'm giving you this image on the right, which is one of a tally stick, or in Irish, this is called a batascurd. And the batascurd goes back to the 1830s, the founding of the national school system, whereby the attempt was made by the colonial administration to root the Irish language out. So to teach English to Irish children, and if Irish children, they wore this stick around their necks, and if they were caught speaking Irish anywhere in the schoolroom or the schoolyard, a little notch was made. You can see the notches there. And when the notch was made, then by the end of the week, you would be beaten as many times as you had notches on your stick. And so this brutally violent way of trying to expunge one language and control it in order to foster the other is repeated by the father in Hamilton's memoir, but he of course reverses it. He metes out the corporal punishment in order to banish the English language and to create the pure national Gaelic-speaking homeland. So what he does is he repeats the past, but inverts its values. So I wanted to draw that passage to your attention. And the other passage, and then I'll open up for questions, that I wanted to look at as well, is the suppression of an earlier past that is not consonant with and I'll stop the share there as well, that is not consonant with one's self-image. And I think this is a really key point because it brings the German and Irish histories of these families together in a particularly poignant way when the narrator realizes that his grandfathers, neither of whom he ever knew, must have fought opposite each other in World War I. So in an interview recently with the Irish memoirist and academic Emily Pine, who's done a lot of work as well on the legacies of the industrial schools and clerical abuse in Ireland. She's in the English department at UCD. And I was interviewing her recently. I had that pleasure. And we talked a bit about memoirs because she's written a very well-received one called Notes to Self. And in Notes to Self, she talks a lot about her father. And I asked her if she had ever contemplated bringing in her grandparents into that memoir and talking about the grandparental generation. And we thought about this for a while. And what we concluded was that to talk about one's parents remains in the realm of autobiography and biography. To talk about the grandparental generation always brings us into history. And that's exactly what happens on page 12, when the narrator in Hamilton realizes that he's not allowed to have access to John Hamilton, his paternal grandfather, because John Hamilton is fought as effectively a British soldier. He was in the British Navy, we read on page 12. And he received medals for his role in this conflict. He fell on a British naval vessel called HMS Vivid when he was only 28 years of age. I didn't know any of that. So what has happened is that the imperial past of the grandparental generation has been expunged out of the family narrative, that this is a regime, the regime of the Hamilton household is predicated on expunging parts of the past that don't fit its own self-image. So I wanted to draw.
So now Caitríona's gone again, I think. Yeah, does anyone have any comments? Maybe no questions directed to Caitríona directly at this point, but maybe anything that you would like to comment on, or any observations you made when you read the two excerpts from, Scali's book, The Best Catholics of the World, and Hamilton's The Speckled People. What is your reader response to those books, and also to how Caitríona presented them to us and tied them together in her talk? Any thoughts? Antonio, go ahead.
Maybe just some sort of reader response. What surprised me most, almost shocked me, was when I read The Speckled People, I was aware, or rather I anticipated, that there might be this kind of ostracization, that the family isn't really accepted because they are from Germany. But I didn't think that there would be, in fact, sympathizers who will actively confront them by kind of, so to say, reassuring the German part of the family, saying something like, it was a great thing you did it because he damaged the British. So we see that through this hate, through the oppression, more hate is in fact created, of course, but then also that it makes it harder to kind of work with this, because you have this really polarizing approach where half of the population doesn't want to have anything to do with you, where you are pretty much shunned because you are German, because you speak German, and there's the other part that welcomes it because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to say, in this way. So I didn't anticipate the second half, that there wouldn't be opposition, but in fact kind of support, which is problematic as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks very much. That's a very good observation, I think. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Anything that you'd like to comment on? Yeah, Nina, go ahead.
I really enjoyed this question of how do we deal with the past and how it was discussed in The Best Catholics. So this question of how do I also work with, or how do I handle this question of, is this my fault? Do I have to still make up for something that happened in the past? And I think here the question, or the parallels between German interaction with the past and Irish interaction with the past got more even more interesting than the first mention of this Vergangenheitsbewältigung. So I thought the way that was presented, even though we just had this, what was it, 40 pages, 30 pages that we read, still was already very interesting. I think I want to go back into that book and read more about this. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. And what do people think about the coupling of the two books, the Scali and the Hamilton book. What do you make of that? Do you think that was something that worked well? Amy, you unmuted yourself. If you could also say something else.
Yeah, I was struck by the role of language in both, and the suppression of language in the Best Catholics in the World. He said that, and of course, wherever child abuse cases are revealed, it very often takes decades for the victims to be able to voice what happened to them. So there's a suppression of language going on, whether they speak one language or two languages or three languages, it doesn't really matter. And then in the speckled people, you have children growing up with three languages, and they're not allowed to use all three, although they have access to all three. And you have a suppression there going on as well.
Yeah, so silences and forbidden languages. I think that the most striking thing for me in the Hamilton book was that, English was probably the language that they would have used most if the regime at home hadn't been as it was. Yeah, because this was the language that was spoken where they lived. Yeah, Bianca, go ahead. You have another comment.
Yeah, I also found that aspect very interesting, how language and identity are linked together, and how kind of the protagonist in the Speckled People had three identities, but he was kind of forbidden to create like an international identity or to link them all together. So he was not able to separate them.
Yeah, and I think that's something that ties in with the Scally book, where Scally has been living and exploring German culture for so long, and then goes back and visits Ireland again, and then starts thinking about German culture and German history and Irish culture and Irish history, and where he also, like Caitríona described it, becomes kind of that hybrid intercultural traveler. And we see that with the children in the Speckled People as well, I think.
Yeah, and I also found that interesting about the lecture, that she divided it into childhood and then adulthood, where like you can choose which identity you want to shape, or which languages you prioritize, or which past you want to investigate further.
Yes. Yeah, that's very interesting. Caitríona, we've been talking about your presentation and the two books for quite a bit now. People said a bit about their reader responses to the Scally book and the Hamilton book. And we were just now starting the discussion a bit about how the two books work together. I don't know if you do have one more question or so that you would like to pose, so that we can round off the session.
No, I'm so sorry about the link. It just crashed and threw me out of the meeting. No, I just love to hear how people got on and what they thought about this attempt, particularly Scally's attempt, which is different because it's part of a deliberately conceived intellectual project, whereas the other one comes out of biography, the fact of having a German mother and an Irish speaking father. And so I think in a way, Scally's, historically poses more questions, much and all as I love Hamilton's book. But Hamilton's book, as coming back to Damian's point, biography is something we're just born into. We don't have a choice in the matter. Whereas Scally has chosen to try to interpret this traumatic chapter in recent Irish history through the lens of how Germany has dealt with its own traumatic and violent past. Sorry, I see Maria has a question.
Yeah, Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, first, thank you for your talk, and I hope you stay here for my question. In Scally's book, we get kind of reference to you mentioned it as well, GDR, to Eastern German communism or East German communism. And he, in a way, assumes that the Germans are engaging kind of with their past and doing this, what you called Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And he doesn't see, at least this is what I read, he doesn't see anything comparable going on in Ireland. But I don't agree to this. I think that we have to see that in a more differentiated way, because it's not like a general, we don't want to deal with our past. How do you see that in your country? Or do you think he is right, that there is no thing such as, engaging earnestly, actually, with your past?
I mean, part of it could be to do with what he talks about in the final section, which is about infrastructures, sites of memory, museums, the kind of infrastructure that you need to enable engagement with the past as a sort of foundation of education for democracy. And for various reasons, partly to do with the turbulent recent economic history of Ireland, within less than 10 years of these revelations being the floodgates which emptied the churches, and it really was very dramatic. It was almost like overnight people stopped going to mass. You know, that's not an exaggeration in terms of how we perceived it at the time. That then straight away we were into the Celtic Tiger, and then we were into the crash, you know, so it's almost as if there hasn't been the space, the time and the resources to really engage with this and to create the infrastructure that Germany's traumatic past, particularly going back to the years 33 to 45, while of course there was a period of cultural amnesia in the 1950s, then from around 68, you had a systematic attempt to grapple with this as part of education for democracy. And that in Ireland, I don't see it evolved to the same degree, and also because it's still very close, it's within living memory. Many people are still practicing Catholics and they have their own path that they need to tread in terms of that difficult relationship. You know, Mary McAleese, the former president, has spoken of this. You know, she herself is a practicing Catholic and yet one who tried to advance the cause of women within the church, and you know, so it's a very difficult terrain.
Yeah, thank you.
Anne, you have a question.
Was it Anne?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I was also wondering about Derek Skelly and how he compared the German Vergangenheitsbewältigung to contemporary Irish struggles with the Irish, you know what I'm talking about. And I was grappling especially with the fact that the Irish Catholic Church is still existent basically today, whereas the GDR regime, for example, simply ceased to exist over time, and how the fact that the church still exists might affect or influence this discussion and even the dealing with the past, and yeah, whether that could be a disadvantage or an advantage even, because they can't really distance themselves, like the German, for example, maybe did. Like they said, that was so long ago and it wasn't us. Yeah, I was simply wondering how that could affect this comparison and the discussion.
Yeah, that's a really good question about how the past continues into the present. So I'd say two things there, which is that while the GDR as a regime was dismantled very quickly overnight, almost too quickly for some people who had grown up within it, nevertheless, its legacy continued on and is palpable today in certain cultural and social differences between Eastern and Western provinces in Germany. So it doesn't become dismantled overnight. And I was teaching with another group of students the wonderful film by Christian Petzold, Barbara, which was made in 2012. And the director said, only now is it becoming possible to make good films about the GDR. You know, that everything up to that point was just kind of nostalgia. So, you know, how is the past present in the present? And what I'd say about the Catholic Church, of course, it continues to exist. You know, churches in every neighborhood, still quite a high level of practicing Catholicism. But I suppose what most of us notice, those of us who grew up still in Catholic Ireland, is the dramatic falling off of the huge, overwhelming kind of domineering presence of the church in our daily lives, in our schools, in our families, in our rituals, that's not such a given anymore. So while there's not a complete dismantling of the institution, there's a radical reduction in its presence in the state, in public discourse. I mean, it used to be, you know, and I think, you know, you're familiar with a lot of that part of the history that, you know, the bishops had to be consulted about everything, you know, that the constitution was written with the archbishops sitting around the table, and that's all moved on. And I think 2 points I'd say there, and Scally talks about them as well. One is the marriage equality referendum, and the other one was the repeal the 8th referendum, both within very recent years, which also gave expression to this radical shift, which I think that does mean that we can continue to make the comparison, even though you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to conclude here. Thank you again, Caitríona, for you know, bringing those 2 books to our notice. I think not many of us had read or heard of the books before, and most of us were very impressed by what we found there. We do have a half-hour break now. What we want to do is we want to show you a clip that we used during our kickoff event earlier this year, and it's a clip of traditional Irish music. Ella Schlotos, who's one of the practitioners in the clip, is here and allowed us to use it. So you can stay here or just move around and listen to the music. And we'll meet again, I would say, Maria, what do you say? Shall we say 10 minutes after 4? Would that be okay?
Yeah, or 5 minutes after 4, would that be fine for everybody?
Yeah? Okay, so let's say 5 after 4, and then we'll resume with session 3 and 4. Okay, so thank you very much. See you in a bit.
Okay, now everybody's back from the break. I hope you had an enjoyable break and have a nice cup of coffee with you or tea, and we can continue. Yes, and I have the pleasure today to introduce Ina Bergmann to you. Ina Bergmann is an associate professor of American Studies at the University of Würzburg, and she is the co-founder, together with me, of Irish Studies Würzburg. She's also a member of the International Research Network, Pathologies of Solitude. She's a board member of the European Network for Short Fiction Research and a peer reviewer for the international journals, American Literatures, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, Green Letters, Studies in Eco-Criticism, Journal of Short Fiction in Theory and Practice, and Journal of the Short Story in English. She has held fellowships with the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford, the Trinity Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute at Trinity College in Dublin, and the Huntington Library Art Collections and Botanical Gardens at San Marino in California. She is the author of 2 monographs, first title, and then The Child Becomes a Woman, 2003, and the 19th Century Revisited, the new historical fiction just published recently in this year by Routledge. She's also the co-editor of 9 volumes of essays and special issues of journals, among them Liminality and the Short Story, Boundary Crossings in American, Canadian, and British Writing, and Cultures of Solitude, Loneliness, Limitation, Liberation, and the last one, Intermediality, Life, Writing, and American Studies, Interdisciplinary Perspectives, as well as frequent contributor to peer-reviewed journals and, of course, also international book projects. So that's quite a lot. Ina, I look very much forward to your talk, and the stage is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria, for that kind introduction, listing all of my achievements exhaustively, I think. So I'll start my presentation here. And again, this is the 3rd session of our study day, Journeys Across the Waves, Discovering Irish Identity. And I entitled my part, The Green Atlantic. And this is my structure. It looks a lot longer than it will be. I'll talk a bit about the transatlantic American studies and Irish American studies as a branch of them. I'll then turn to the reading, or you read for today an excerpt from Colin McCann's novel Transatlantic, and I'll show you how I interpret it as a transatlantic and Irish American novel. I'll then turn briefly to Colin McCann's Transatlantic as new historical fiction. And finally, I'll try to embed my findings into the new Irish studies, and then we'll have a chance for discussion. So I'll talk first about transatlantic American studies. Transatlantic American studies seek to give accounts of literary and cultural developments and phenomena, replacing the nation state with the Atlantic world as a site of cultural production. So nation has become a heavily contested concept. Rather than dwelling on comparisons or engaging with a notion of influence, transatlantic literary studies seek to understand, especially here, in my case, North American and English literature and Irish literature, usually as they focus on this part of the area as irreducibly linked with each other by virtue of historical and cultural ties. And transatlantic American studies pay special attention to the many refractions and mutual interferences that have characterized these traditions. So we can say that transatlantic American studies are a revision, or aim at a revision of literary history They are a rethinking of preconceived ideas of the canon and a national literature. They give us a new approach to genres and texts. They reconsider the literary market, especially the Anglo-American literary market, and its manifold processes of production, distribution, reception, and criticism. So what is this Atlantic world we're talking about? And of course, it comprises more than just, the exchange between America and Europe, or the Anglo-American exchange. And you can see that here on the map. But it comprises the interactions among the peoples and nations bordering on the Atlantic Ocean. But of course, here the focus will be on the exchange between America and Ireland. The transatlantic approach then focuses, or rather than only stressing the historical and cultural bonds that have tied Europe and North America together for centuries, or presenting comparative interpretations, transatlantic studies focus on the process of cultural production, the modes of circulation and exchange that enabled cultures to develop, the materialities of Atlantic culture, as well as different facets and forms of mobility. And all of these points will be points that we can return to when we look at the text. So the transatlantic approach, or transatlantic literary studies, more specifically, refrain from drawing hard demarcation lines, also with regard to chronologies. And towards both British and American literature, its history as well as its self-definition as body of writing and discipline, the transatlantic approach takes into account the multiple reflections and distortions that arise once the mutuality of interests and investments, the shared dimension of experiences, preferences, and approaches are embraced positively and not in terms of an exception. And this is the main literature that I based this first part of my presentation on. I'll now move on to Irish American Studies as a branch or segment of transatlantic American studies. And I'll first try to explain the term that I adopted as the title for my presentation, the Green Atlantic. So what is the Green Atlantic? The Green Atlantic describes the transatlantic circulation of Irish people, ideologies, and goods. And the term stems from a comparison with the Black Atlantic, a term that was coined by Paul Gilroy in 1993. Green, of course, here is used because it is seen as the color of the Irish. An alternative term for the Green Atlantic would, of course, also be the Irish Atlantic. Now, when we look at the Green Atlantic, of course, Irish immigration is one of the important issues here. There have been various waves of immigration. Some history books name 6 decisive waves of Irish immigration. Some of them I just put down on the slide for you. The first one is the indentured servants who were sent to the colonies in the 17th century. The most important wave, or most talked about, written about wave in literature is most probably when the Irish migrants were flowing into America as a result of the Great Famine, roughly between 1845 and 52. And from the mid-20th century on, there has been a decrease of Irish immigration to the US. So when we talk about Irish America, we can assert that Irish people have left their mark on many aspects of Atlantic societies, most specifically in America. Most works on the Irish diaspora focus on America, since it was the destination of most Irish migrants. Many families, many American families, claim Irish ancestry with pride. And you just need to have a look at the presidents, for example, the Kennedys, most prominently. Most recently, President Biden, who visited Ballina as his ancestral home, and then also President Obama, whose visit to Ireland is still something that is cherished by the Irish people. In the 2010 census, 34.7 million Americans indicated Irish affiliation. And they form what we call the Irish diaspora. The Irish diaspora refers to ethnic Irish people and their descendants who live outside the island of Ireland. And in the chart here, the largest Irish population in the world outside of the island of Ireland, which is shown in black here, it's very tiny, is shown in dark green. And as you can see, unsurprisingly, this is to be found in Australia and, of course, in North America. So what do we mean when we use the term Irish American? Whether we should use that with a hyphen or with a gap between the two words is probably a question for, I don't know, the discussion or for another day. But what do we mean when we use the term Irish American? We can say it's a somewhat ephemeral identity formation that can be challenging to pin down for analytical and policy purposes. And we might say it occupies the liminal cultural spaces between Ireland and America. And this cultural space is really difficult to demarcate, being simultaneously as small as the gap between two words or the hyphen between two words, and as wide as the Atlantic Ocean. When we turn to Irish American literature, it's similarly difficult to pin that down. We might assert that it's a constantly changing and evolving field, and that it needs constant updating to keep up with an ever-expanding scope. It's not limited to writers and artists born in Ireland, and texts, so we would use that wider definition of the text to include other media that cover the hybrid Irish American experience would be covered by Irish American literature and culture or media. The combination of Irish and American subject matters in one cultural product. I'd say that's a good working definition of what Irish American literature and art or media are. And we could count among Irish American literature works by Irish and American writers which contribute to transatlantic themes. And I hope you realized that in the last couple of slides, I highlighted the terms liminal or liminality and hybrid or hybridity. And I'd like to close that off with a quote by Homi K. Bhabha, who says the liminal space between fixed identifications is itself a site of hybridity that facilitates the mingling and crossing of race, class, gender, and other differences. And I think this ties in with our larger question today about identity and creating identity. And these are the main sources I used for this part of the presentation. So I'll now turn to Colin McCann's Transatlantic as a Transatlantic and Irish American novel. Colin McCann can be viewed as an Irish American writer. He was born and raised in Dublin in Ireland. He now lives in New York City in the USA. He started his career as a journalist. He's the author of a large number of books, 7 novels, 3 collections of short stories today. It's interesting that he is the recipient of many international awards and prizes on both sides of the Atlantic. So the National Book Award and the International Dublin Impact Prize, for example. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts in 2017 and currently teaches creative writing at Hunter College in New York. As I said, he's the author of novels, short story collections, and some other titles of books. And these are just his novels. And as you can see, Transatlantic was his 6th and so far penultimate novel. And to round off this little introduction to the author, I wanted to show you this quote. And I'm really only interested in this bold part of it in a bit more detail, which I find quite interesting and revealing with regard to the novel Transatlantic. McCann says, I love the fact that our stories can cross all sorts of borders and boundaries. And Colin McCann's Transatlantic delivers exactly what readers would expect from its title. The novel features transatlantic settings on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, from Canada and the United States of America to the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And it also features settings in Great Britain, as we'll see in a minute. And it covers a very large time frame from 1845 to 2012. And this is the structure of the title. It has a prologue and 3 books. And the excerpts that you read for today are Freeman, about Frederick Douglass, and aspects of the abolitionist movement, which is set in 1845 and 46. And Icehouse, that's the first section in book 2, which is set between 1863 and 89. And the main character is Lily Duggan, later Lily Fitzpatrick, and even later Lily Ehrlich. And she is opposed to Frederick Douglass, who is, of course, a historical persona. She is a fictional character. So the second chapter, as I said, of book 1 focuses on Frederick Douglass, whom you can see here. He was born approximately in 1817, 1818, and he died in 1895. He escaped slavery and became the leader of the abolitionist movement in the US. He was very well known and popular as an American orator, and he's the author of, most prominently, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was published in 1845, which is the classic slave narrative. Douglass visited Ireland in 1845-46 during the Great Famine. He gave a large number of speeches, as you can see on this map, which you can find online. And the novel follows part of his travels in Ireland. I'll briefly talk about the plot lines of the prologue, book 2, and book 2, where the second excerpt stems from, and book 3, because they are interconnected. These parts of the novel follow a matrilineal fictional storyline that covers the time frame from 1845 to 2012. Their focus is on a family of women. The matriarch is Lily Duggan, and she emigrates from Ireland to the US as a young girl, fends independently for herself and her children, and realizes the American dream by becoming a businesswoman. And for the rest of these chapters, the rest of the chapters of the book mainly follow her female offspring. So her daughter, Emily Ehrlich, her granddaughter, Lottie Ehrlich, and her great-great-granddaughter, Hannah Tuttle, who does not have a daughter, but then this young woman, even Quinlan, steps in and seems to take over this role. The novel, as I mentioned before, is full of truly transatlantic settings, and I'm only giving you the main places here. You can see Canada, USA, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Great Britain, and so on. All of this displays the cultural mobility of the people of the Green Atlantic as it is presented in Colin McCann's novel. The main characters whom I'm showing you here cross the Atlantic, and it's noteworthy that their crossings range from temporary to permanent, and there are also reverse crossings. So overall, we might say that McCann's characters are inveterately restless and nomadic. They are migrants, outsiders, travelers, and border crossers. They move perpetually between countries and fluidly straddle and combine identities. And these are my main sources for this part of the presentation. So now I'd like to have a quick look at transatlantic as new historical fiction. The renaissance of historical fiction is a transatlantic phenomenon, and the last 25 years have seen an unprecedented height in the genre, even surpassing its heyday in the 19th century. Historical fiction has shifted its focus from the movers and shakers of times past, great men and the countries they ran and conquered, to people and themes that had previously remained in the background, neglected topics such as common people's daily lives and how they were affected or not by major events. In the new historical fiction, the maps and chaps version of history has given way to an interest in social history. The new historical fiction revisits history and thereby revises the historical record, bringing on a shift from master narrative to micro narrative. The narration of individual memory gains universal validity, providing a collective or cultural memory and creating a cultural or national identity. The traditional definition of history as great deeds of great men, chronological accounts of battles and borders, treaties and territories had positioned women as mere bystanders in the historical process. Hegemonic history excluded women as well as the female sphere. It called for a feminist revision of historiography by challenging the narrative line of political history. So this idea of white men make history. Herstory is a trend that since roughly the 1970s has sought to compensate for the absence of women in historiography. The term defines a reformulation of history with the aim of addressing imbalances and blind spots. Herstory shifts the focus towards recovery and revision. Herstory constructs a voice for historically silenced figures. It must be read as an instance of agency and emancipation. And these are my main sources for this part of the presentation. And now towards my last part, how can we situate Colin McCann's transatlantic into the new Irish studies? The terms Irish writer or Irish literature, once aligned neatly with the author's nationality or the text setting, are now moving targets that reflect the durability and adaptability of Irish writing in the present moment. So New Irish Studies attends to the particularities of Irish culture in a global moment, continues to advocate interdisciplinary thinking, holds the ground on the ideological openness earned in part by feminist, queer, and critical race studies. And to round that off, I'd like to ask whether, where can we see public value in contemporary literature? And I'm quoting Derek Attridge here from an essay by Margaret Kelleher. The value of literature as literature lies not in any predictable effects, but in the continuous exploration by writers of what lies outside the limits of the knowable world and in the repeated experience of alterity by readers. These are valuable functions because a culture that is entirely enclosed within its familiar boundaries, operating with its familiar stereotypes and prejudices, is one that cannot fully foster the potential of its members. And I think if we take all of that into account, we can see that Colin McCann's transatlantic really displays the topics of mobility, diversity, and transnationalism as outlined in the approaches of transatlantic American, Irish American, and New Irish studies. McCann's novel revisits the Green Atlantic, its traditions and its heritage, revises historiography, and recovers her story. And all in all, it delivers what we might call public value. And these are my sources for the New Irish Studies. And I do have a couple of questions I'm sorry, I do have to go back, that we could address, but don't have to address necessarily in the discussion. How are Ireland and the Irish described through the eyes of Frederick Douglass? How are the US and the Americans described through the eyes of Lily Duggan? Can Douglass and Duggan be interpreted as liminal or hybrid characters? I think I may have already tried to answer that. What is the function of connecting and juxtaposing Douglass's with Duggan's stories? Freeman with Ice House, the historical with a fictional, the male with a female, and the black with a green Atlantic. Can we draw any lessons from the backward clans that the novel offers? Does it have any relevance for the present day? Why do we read this text? Why do we want to read this text? Or should we read this text? And which label would you give the novel? Irish, American, transatlantic, new historical, new Irish, or maybe you can come up with additional ideas. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ina, for this great talk. And you already brought your discussion questions, which is nice to have. Yes, and I can open the discussion now for, well, coming back to your talk, to the book, to the novel, or yeah, I don't know if you want to have the questions in the window here, in the screen.
Yeah, I could go back to that if you want me to.
Or are there any maybe more general questions or comments or anything you would like to ask?
Yes, thank you. I'd encourage people to just, you know, whatever they want to talk about.
There is a hand. Yes, Amy.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for your fabulous paper, and thanks for making me finally read Transatlantic. It's been sitting on my shelf for years and I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to ask you about the ending, because the final chapter, because after all this mobility going back and forth, the last chapter seems very rooted in place, and we have this woman who's bogged down by a house that's just causing her trouble, and I just and of course there's also this sort of, but it's never really said, but it seems as if it's kind of one of those big houses in Ireland, and the big houses have a very difficult history in Ireland. And I just wondered what you make of that last chapter in comparison to all the crisscrossing and mobility that was going on in the chapters before that.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Amy. That's a very good question. And I think what I would say as a short answer, and then I'll try to give you a longer one. The short answer would be, I don't read the last chapter as the last chapter. I read the last chapter as the chapter before the prologue. Because I think the prologue can only be understood if you've read the whole book. And then the whole story comes full circle, and it starts again in the same house, in the cottage in Northern Ireland. And then even Quinlan has, you know, she takes over from the Duggan family women, and she's now the woman who owns the cottage. And she's an interesting character because she is Irish through and through. She's from Dublin, but she is married to men from Kenya, who's you know, teaching at university in Dublin, which I think also brings the whole story full circle with the Frederick Douglass storyline in quite some way, African-American issues and so on. So what I think in the book, Colin McCann starts the book and he says, no history is mute, no matter, with a quote by Eduardo Galeano, no history is mute, no matter how much they own it, break it, and lie about it. Human history refuses to shut its mouth. Despite deafness and ignorance, the time that was continues to tick inside the time that is. And then towards the end, there are a couple of hints again at this Mobius strip. So the story goes on in eternity. I think the Galeano quote points to that. And then towards the end, even Quillen's children are read a fairy tale, and there's a passage when it says, "Once upon a time," she began, "I stood at the door and listened. There isn't a story in the world that isn't in part, at least, addressed to the past." And the last sentence of the book, the novel, is really, we have to admire the world for not ending on us. And I think that's directing us back to the beginning of the story. So that would be the long answer.
Yeah, thank you, Ina, for that. I saw another hand. I think it was Nina, but I don't know. You put it down.
It was less of a question and more of a comment. So I wanted to let people who might have questions go first, but if there's nobody else right now, I'll just go ahead and wanted to comment on that I first of all enjoyed Transatlantic quite a lot. And I thought it was really, really interesting to see in this book how the story is told or how the story shows also how historical events affect personal lives and how we can reread and retell history through these personal accounts, so to say, through these biographies in the different generations that are depicted. And apart from the fact that I quite like the fact that it was a story about her story, so that it was a female line, I was wondering in the beginning, how will this be tied in together at the end? So how will this is so spread out, how will this all come back together? And I thought this is beautifully done, but it also tells quite a lot about different lived realities through time and space also, but how they still refer back and forth. And so, yeah, I think these two things, so time and space referring back and forth, and also history being told through personal accounts, is something that is very nicely done in this book, and that I found most fascinating here. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Nina. I totally agree with everything you said, and I think it's also the what seemed to be disparate stories are so subtly tied together at certain points, and there's recurring symbols and recurring materialities, the letter that returns and so on. And so it's really an interesting book, but it needs you to delve into it a bit. So it unravels itself only, I'd say it starts to unravel itself when you're half through, and it only unravels itself completely once you've completed reading it, and then think about it again from the beginning, as I just tried to point out when I've answered Amy's question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't put up my hand because I'm speaking anyways. And well, it is kind of a follow-up question to what Nina just said or asked, a bit different. You talked about this matrilineal storyline, which I like actually as a term. And in which way do you see the hopes and maybe also the failures of the previous generations kind of living on in this kind of present day story on this matrilineal storyline? So in which ways do you see that reflected in the novel?
Yeah, I think this is partly what Amy, I think, was concerned with, that towards the end it gets, Lily is this self-made woman, and it seems that her offspring is less and less able to cope with the challenges of their times. I think especially this great granddaughter, I guess, yeah, Hannah at the end,
Hannah, yeah.
Is really struggling with the whole situation. so that might be something that we see as problematic. But then on the other hand, as I think it's really also hopeful as she passes on this relay baton, we could say, to even Quinlan, who takes it up willingly and starts maybe a new circle or a new matrilineal storyline at the end of the novel. What I also find interesting about the book is that it's as if McCann really ticks off all of the relevant historical events that happened between 1845 and 2012. You know, we really have it all. We have the Troubles, we have the Great Famine, we have the Depression. It's all there. And what I also find remarkable and interesting is that still, even if Hannah in the end is struggling, she's a survivor. And interestingly enough, if you think of all of the stories, all of the husbands and all of the male offspring in one way or another are killed off or die. And so I think he makes a very strong point with regard to her story, and that this is the social history that exists behind or between the lines, this hegemonic history. So we have the first book where we have this maps and chaps version of history, and then we have the whole book turning this round and looking at her story and creating her story for this Irish American past, which I quite like about the book.
Yeah, thank you. Damian, I see your hand. I don't see yourself. Yes, no.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Ina. I really enjoyed that. You covered a really a lot of ground there. I don't have a question. It's more really a comment. Frederick Douglass lived for a month in Cork, where I live. And in the summer, they sort of I'm not sure, I haven't seen it, but there were plans
to put a plaque, right?
Yeah, but they were also going to do a Frederick Douglass Trail. So he spent a month here giving a lot of speeches and making a number of important contacts, including Daniel O'Connell. When he was in Ireland, he met Daniel O'Connell. So it was really a sort of a meeting of a meeting of the liberators, a meeting of the two impressive leaders who championed the cause of the downtrodden, and that really is the voice which shaped Irish America. Irish America is really associated with that particular wave of migrants, but they were far from the first. In the 18th century, the largest group to start migration from Ireland to the United States came from the northern part of Ireland, what they call the Scots Irish. So if you look at their legacy, it's quite extraordinary. When you think of Irish American presidents, you think of Kennedy, obviously, and you would think of Biden, maybe. But there's a long list of Scots Irish presidents of the United States, and they're sort of airbrushed out of the picture. They don't appear on the list when you're calibrating or you're detailing the migration from this part of the world to North America. They tend not to appear, which is interesting.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. I've seen that, I don't know, on Twitter or I don't know, Facebook, whatever, that this plague was put up. And there was recently also an exhibition, I think, of Frederick Douglass in Ireland, in Dublin. I attended an online opening of that exhibition. So it's a very, before I started researching the book, I was really not aware of the impact this had on Irish Americans or Irish America or the Irish also in the first place. Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, I think America likes, America likes the story of downtrodden made good, people who are poor making it. It's the American dream. And that's what the Irish America is, people who came from difficulty and made a success of their lives. Whereas the Scots-Irish were privileged anyhow. They did well. And when Barack Obama came to Ireland, there was an attempt to bring him to Cork. So they commissioned a statue of Frederick Douglass, which he was supposed to unveil. And it didn't happen. And it was a stupid thing to do anyhow, because Barack Obama was coming to Ireland to appeal to Irish American voters to trace his Irish ancestors. So he was coming to Ireland to show his whiteness rather than his blackness. So that was a plan which wasn't realized.
That's interesting. Yeah, thanks very much. I didn't know that. Yeah.
I don't know what that statue is. It's there somewhere. I still think they should unveil it, but I think it's rotting in a warehouse somewhere.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this comment, Damian. And thank you, again, for your brilliant talk.
Thanks very much.
I think we have to carry on with the program. So I think, Damian, it's your turn now.
Sorry about that. I'm back again. Okay, so this is the final paper, and it's my privilege to introduce someone who doesn't need any introduction, certainly not to this group, Professor Maria Eisenmann, who is chair of English methodology in Würzburg, and she is the founder, along with Ina Bergmann, of the Irish Studies program there, and they deserve everybody's thanks and congratulations for getting that off the ground. I could list Maria's academic achievements and her publications, but I think we will be here for a very long time if I did. So what I'll do is I'll give a very, very quick overview of her extraordinarily broad interests and publications in various fields. Professor Eisenmann is interested in language acquisition and the pedagogy of teaching and learning the English language. In English language texts spanning from Shakespeare down to the digital age, and also in the role of language as a culture marker and in culture formation in the Anglophone world. And she has published in the fields of American studies and Irish studies. And her talk, which is going to close out this study day, is literary literacy in ELT. And she's looking at the question of literary literacy, focusing in particular on Tobin's wonderful 2009 novel, Brooklyn. So Maria, if we will melt into the background and let you take center stage.
Okay, thank you very much for this lovely and very kind introduction, Damian. I hope everybody can see my presentation. I go to full screen. Great. I see you nodding. Yeah, lovely. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you for all your brilliant talk so far. Now, go there. Yes, coming from, I think I have to show a bit of my background, coming from teaching English as a foreign language, or as we call it, English language teaching. I am again and again grappling actually with the question as to whether and why literature should or should not be taught and learned in a foreign language or in foreign language teaching. In fact, this is a question that is discussed in our community, and it has been asked over and again in the light of changing educational and also socio-cultural demands. And I think this is not that easy to answer. Now, when you look at the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, in short CEF, which is usually our background where we refer to, literature is basically conceptualized as a linguistic or multimodal aesthetic artifact. It is also kind of defined as a cultural product with social as well as moral, emotional, and cognitive dimensions, but it does not specify actually how these contribute to the multiple educational purposes of literature, let alone the pleasure of reading, of course. However, reading literature in general can contribute to education as envisioned by educators and philosophers. And in German, we have this lovely term Bildung for that as a background, which is very hard to translate. We use the term education, but it means something different, or it includes Bildung, but basically I would like to use this term. So literature can offer its readers the opportunity to see the world from a different perspective. Literature can also motivate the subject identification with others, as well as support the appreciation of both the self as well as the other. And it may also provoke thought on language and values. What is more is ambiguities and complexity. It challenges judgment in a way and cultivates aesthetic taste. So discussion in context provides useful insights into the systematic as well as historical relationships of social, cultural, and economic phenomena. Now, in other words, and this is what you can see here, to put it into a nutshell, teaching literature in English enhances literary literacy, which means to support the development of vocabulary on the one hand, but also reading strategies, critical literacy, media literacy, and or transcultural competence at the same time. Hence, if you look at what does it mean, literary literacy, I think literature is a major tool for fostering critical thinking, for developing empathy for other people, and literature may also kind of trigger reflection on the reader's own emotions, thoughts, as well as actions, basically. Moreover, literary texts play a major part in promoting the intercultural, but also the cross-cultural aspects. It's not only inter and transcultural, but also cross-cultural aspects of learning, as well as global education that we deal with in EFL methodology these days. And especially, of course, to promote communicative competence. I see the field of intercultural communicative competence actually as the key issue why we deal with literature in the EFL classroom as well as in a seminar context at university, which is more or less the same. It's just an age difference, I would say. So the rationale behind this proposition is based in the very nature of literary reading, as both we have the cognitive process as well as the affective process, which allows for personal encounters with otherness and prompts the reader to reflect on this kind of perspectivity of different cultural viewpoints. And in Combe-Tobin's novel, Brooklyn, for instance, we go beyond intercultural learning because it is a text basically about cross-cultural encounters. Now, in the context of literary literacy, many scholars actually made up a variety of dimensions of skill development in terms of literary literacy, skill development dimensions. For instance, the 7 dimensions described by Laurens Volkmann, or the model proposed by Lütke, based again on Hallett's 4 dimensions of literary literacy. And I briefly get into that. We have literary reading competence as a first one, which includes kind of general reading skills or close reading. As a second one, we have literary as cultural competence, which we basically here focus. That means including recognizing intercultural as well as historical knowledge in literature, but also using literary texts as templates for individual as well as personal narrative responses. As a third one, we have competence in reflection, which includes reflecting actions, as well as attitudes and values. This is where we usually come from Michael Byram's system of attitudes, values, etc. So his intercultural communicative competence development, and this is presented in literary work. And the last one will be competence of foreign language discourse, which includes recognizing but also making use of foreign language discourse in literature for the learner's communication, but also for the learner's interaction, which is also important. However, as far as methods are concerned, perspectives on how to approach literary texts have changed over time. And I'm sure you know about that because we used many different methods in the last decades. And similar to this, we call it the post-method condition, because we have actually tried out a variety of methods that generally describes EFL classroom practice today. There is, I would call it a post-theoretical stance on teaching literature. And this kind of theory mixing necessitates approaching a single text from multiple perspectives, for example, by considering reader response, but also thinking of intertextuality or looking at form issues, performative aspects, and or multimodality at the same time. So we have a huge variety actually, which is around. No matter which text is integrated into teaching practice, teaching can select from a variety of approaches. A very common method these days for including literary text is this well-known pre-while post-reading approach, which stands for the phases introducing something, pre-reading, while reading, giving help while students might be struggling with the text, and post-reading, listening, or viewing, whatever you do, everything is a text in a way. So in reading or in literary studies, actually, two main approaches to teaching and analyzing literature are the most common in our context. It is the new criticism, so focusing on formal analysis of the text, combined with reader response theory, so focusing on individual reception processes. What do I get out of the text? And both of these approaches lend different valuable insights into the meaning of a text and should thereby be included as complementary processes towards a more complex understanding of a text. Now, in addition, more specialized types of techniques and activities are suitable for working with a variety of texts that can be included into this pre-while and post reading, listening, whatever process. And I just made up a list of these activities. So what you can do is production-oriented activities, which are basically aimed at the creation of new texts, rewriting existing texts, and or creative expansions on transformations of the original. This would be one approach. We also have action-oriented activities, and their objective is getting learners engaged in performative acts or creating a representation of the text in a different medium other than the original. And a performance-based approach would be that you see learners as a constitutive part of the literary reception process by engaging them in acting out perspectives different from their own. For instance, by presenting a monologue or a pantomime or recreating individual scenes up to staging a full kind of performance if you have the time for that. Well, additionally, working with text may include an analysis of aesthetic and cultural aspects of a text with regard to cultural representations, or a discussion on the formal aspects of a text, for instance, literary devices, structure, language style, etc., etc. So, or the impact, the reader's impression, and shape the meaning of a final product. Okay, so that was it for a very theoretical background. Now, let's have a look on the author and his novel. Now, Tobin, I would say, is an internationally acclaimed author and undoubtedly one of the most important contemporary Irish writers. And next to short story collections and other writings, he has written more than 10 novels, including The Master, Brooklyn, of course, which will be the focus in a minute, The Testament of Mary, Nora Webster, and just recently, I don't know who's familiar with that, it was just published in September, The Magician, which tells the life story of Thomas Mann. Now, Tobin was born in Enniscorthy, a small town in County Wexford on the Irish Southeast coast. He was born in 1955 and educated at the University College Dublin. And like his protagonist, Eilish, in his book Brooklyn, Tobin emigrated and returned to his home country. And today he lives in Dublin and New York. And therefore, Brooklyn was the result actually of a need to return to his origins, while at the same time he would reflect on his own exile in many diverse places, actually, such as Barcelona, Argentina, or nowadays the United States. Now, years ago, actually, when he was still a child in his parents' house, he heard the story of a young woman who had emigrated to the United States in search of a better life. And this, I would call it, very poignant tale stayed with him for almost 40 years before he actually decided to rework it, to make it into a fictional narrative, into a story that would also contain a clear social critique of the Ireland of his youth. So the result was Brooklyn, published in 2009, a novel that embraces the rights and injustices, but also the truth and all the myth of Irish expatriates and immigration stories. So as much as his own desire to return to his origin, the author made the following statement, and I had that in my text that I uploaded. I just read it out to you. I never stopped thinking how strange it was that a stray anecdote told almost a half century earlier could stay in my mind that long, linger there and grow. If those two women had known I was listening so intently, I am sure my mother would have decided that the story shouldn't be told until her 12-year-old had left the room. I was lucky that she didn't. Now, what is the novel about? Just, well, in one or two sentences, it is basically, I would call it an archetypal tale of an Irish woman who crosses the Atlantic into exile. We heard about that in Ina Bergmann's talk, who marries secretly and is brought home by the death in a family, her sister, you all know, before returning with a full heart to her life in the new world back again. So the subject of exile, so central to the Irish experience, is one of Tobin's, or one that Tobin finds fascinating throughout his work. You find it in many of his books, actually. Now, the setting of Brooklyn is strongly connected to Tobin's childhood, and Enniscorthy, which you can see here on the right-hand side, is not only the place where the author grew up and spent his life, it is also the place where his family is buried. So he still has a close connection to that. And Enniscorthy, which you can see here in the picture, is the setting, or is the place where the first and the last chapter take place. And Brooklyn on the right is where the middle parts are set. And in the novel, he tells the story of Eilish Lacey, an Irish girl from Enniscorthy who emigrated for work and also for an education. It's not only for making a better life, but she also wants to have a better education. And this is how the story begins. Eilish Lacey, sitting at the window of the upstairs living room in the house on Friary Street, noticed her sister walking briskly from work. And it ends after, well, at least in my publication, more than 260 pages later, with Eilish's imagination of a possible open future. She then closed her eyes and tried to imagine nothing more. Now, what has happened in between? What has happened to Eilish and her life? Can maybe somebody of the students tell us? Just unmute yourselves and fire away. Could I manage to wake you up after a long day? Come on.
I'm just gonna go, even though you were cutting out a little, I think I got the question right. And I think you might be referring to the death of the sister.
Yeah, now what happened actually in between the first and the last sentence?
Oh.
This is what I mean. So what
Oh,
happened?
I'm sorry, because it was just cutting out a little.
Okay.
I might have to go back to the novel then for a second. Sorry.
I think very generally, right, Maria?
Yeah, very generally. I can tell you if you don't feel like that time of the day. Okay, we know Eilish. She is about 20 years old. She's pretty young. She lives in rather poor circumstances, and the setting is in the 50s, mid-50s. She lives with her mother and her sister Rose. And Rose is the one who supports the mother and the sister with her earnings. She's an accountant, and the father has already died. So death is a topic in this novel. They also have 3 older brothers, and they have emigrated to England to make a living. So immigration is also a topic. So the brothers have already left, and it's still just the 2 girls, the sisters. And Eilish sometimes gets poor, I would call it very humiliating temporary job offers as a shop assistant, but she wants to become an accountant like her sister. And her sister is very outgoing, golf playing, quite adventurous, I would say. And one day after a game of golf, Rose brings home Father Flood, a priest who has also emigrated from Ireland to America. And Rose's plan actually works out to persuade Eilish to emigrate to the Irish community in Brooklyn. So this finally works out. And I also brought some questions. So first question, and I would like to go through them quite quickly. How does Eilish development throughout the novel make her a character of hybrid identity? Because I think we do not have to discuss that she has become this character of a hybrid identity, but where can you see that in her development in the novel? Nina.
I think I'm completely back on track now. Sorry before. So I think, for example, the way she gets used to American customs and the way she dresses differently, which is highlighted when she returns home. So I think before she was always admiring her sister's dresses and the way she was dressing herself, and then when she comes back, people are noticing this, and she's also referring to it, and she also does not really want to take her sister's clothes anymore. So we see this outer appearance, but also I think in some points the way she speaks and the way she just acts seems to be a lot different than it was before she left.
Yes, exactly. She is more fashionable, and people in the streets actually asked her and talked to her and mention her clothes and her outer appearance. And this is a reflection of her inner development. Yeah, great. Antonius.
I just thought whether we might even say that it is almost a liminal identity, as I had the feeling that once she really started to feel as if she belonged, let's say, to Ireland, she had to move. And then once again, when she moved back, once she started to accommodate to the American customs. Of course, her sister died, so she had to return. And of course, her outward appearance changes and also her demeanor changes. But when she returns, she's seen as someone almost alien, and that makes her desirable. At least it appeared that way to me. So maybe we could also take this step further and say it is not quite a hybrid identity, but rather a liminal one where she doesn't really belong yet.
Yeah, great. Thank you for this answer. Yeah, and I think one of the key complexities of emigration is kind of, I would call it a reconfiguration of identity that results from beginning a new life. When you emigrate, you have to start, particularly in these days, because she has probably never come across lots of pictures or films of the United States. And then you just start right away to begin a new life in another country. And this, in a way, alteration becomes more complex when individuals return home or travel frequently. And this is actually what Tobin does. And it is also what she does. So she, moves between, I call it between an old and a new homeland, because she does not really, or she has not really decided what is her homeland. And what happens is that these people have to renegotiate their identities based actually on their location. And this is this emergent type, Bergmann just called it Irish American, with this hyphen in between. So this kind of identity that allows for the retention of national identities from either side of the hyphen. So in a way, each shaped by the other to a small degree. So you have a bit of, or a part of Irish and a part of American. And this can be kind of performed flexibly as required by traveling between the two locations. And this is exactly what she does. So I would, however, I would say a successful migration always, in a way, requires an adaptation to this cognitive disjunction between there and here, between then and now, because they move in history, of course. And one possible response is this emergence of whatever you call it, limited or hybrid identity expressed in phrases such as, you probably know that, I'm a Coventry Irish, for example. This is an expression we know from Coventry people who have moved to England. So again, with this hyphen. Yeah, but maybe somebody else, it's not just me talking so much. Where else do you see her or the steps of development throughout the novel? Maybe in the context with the two men, particularly with her husband, Nina?
I think this is partly related to the two men, but I think she grows way more self-determined and confident throughout the whole novel. So she makes this, even though it feels a bit that she is pushed into that marriage, she makes the very deliberate decision at the end to go back and to live with her husband in New York and Brooklyn. So I think she also leaves behind the Irishman. So she makes this very distinct decision to leave, which is different from how she's acting in the beginning when she's first sent to Brooklyn, which was organized by her family, pretty much, or by her sister and I forgot his name.
Rose, her sister.
And father, who was the...
Father Flood.
Father Flood, exactly, by the two of them. And that was not really her decision, even though she just went with it. So this is also, I think, a development we can see in her there.
Yeah, and I think there is one point where you can really see how she's torn between these choices of life when she actually says I wished now that I had not married him, Tony. She's thinking of her husband back in Brooklyn. And she doesn't really mean that because she really loves him. But she's so much torn between these two lives. And of course, also from between the expectations on both sides, because her mother wants her to stay. All her friends, whatever her friends are, they also want her to stay there, and they start to like her development. They can see that. So I think this is she's really battling and fighting in this what I call here dislocation at home and abroad. She has it in both places, and this is a difficulty usually people who are emigrated have to face. Okay, right. Maybe we can carry on with a second question, because I don't see any other hands. Yes, I see another hand, Simon.
Okay, just going back to the whole marriage stuff, I found it quite interesting because she, I think after her sister died, she committed to the marriage to Tony, which is, I also think that she maybe had in mind that when she goes back, she maybe wouldn't return to Brooklyn with not this anchor there.
Exactly. So this was definitely her intention, to make this bond stronger, to go back, because then she's married, and marriage in these days meant probably a lot more than it means today. And divorce was not really in the picture. So this is something that tied her actually to Brooklyn. Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for this answer. Okay, shall we carry on then to the second question? Yeah, why should Irish migration be included as kind of a central topic in the EFL or ELT classroom? What do you think? Ina Bergmann just talked about migration. Marcel?
In my opinion, immigration has always been a vital part of human development. And as such, it should be taught at school. Not just the Irish immigration, but immigration in general. It's so important in today's politics. And yeah, that's one big reason, in my opinion, why it should be taught at school.
Okay, yeah, thank you for this answer. Simon?
I think migration should be taught also especially in the English language learning process, because in the past we just looked at the United Kingdom, then started looking at the United States as well. And I think it's important that we look at all the Englishes and all the mother tongues that are spoken all around the world. And migration is a huge part of this progress, where English landed and where English is the first language. And also, I think if you look at the German history, what is also important for the German learners is that the biggest part of migrants in the United States are German, who also went for similar reasons like the Irish migrants. And there's also comparison to the German history with the Irish history, all according to the United States history. And this is also done with teaching migration in the
yes,
in school. I think that's also a very important part to keep in mind.
Yes, and it has become even more important because Ireland is the only remaining English-speaking country in the EU these days because of Brexit. You all know about that. Yeah, thank you for this answer. There were two more hands which have vanished now. I don't really know who it was.
I pretty much wanted to say the same.
Okay.
Yeah, I also had another aspect, but this one is more about the third question, why Brooklyn? So I'm gonna let you all talk and then I can come back to this.
Yeah, is there another answer to this one here on Irish migration? I don't think so. Yeah, But just to add something, in the 1950s, and this is where the story is set, Ireland was the only country in Europe, apart from East Germany, of course, because they were building this wall, where the population actually declined as a result of massive immigration. And roughly, this is, I read it somewhere, roughly 3 out of every 5 children who grew up in the 1950s in Ireland left the country at some stage just to make it a living. And there were these terms, a decade of doom and gloom, particularly in the 50s, or the worst decade since the famine, the lost decade. You could read all those buzzwords. Yes, but it was actually a problem because agriculture, as you might know, the traditional mainstay of the Irish economy, kind of declined or continued to decline throughout the 1950s. And just to add something, because Kennedy was mentioned quite a lot, I brought this quote, which I think is a very good one because it just hit the point in the 60s. And just read it out. Most countries send out oil or iron, steel or gold or some other crop. But Ireland has had only one export, and that is its people. And that's, I think, this is really sad. But until the mid-90s, Ireland was generally regarded as a country of immigration, not only in the 50s. And in fact, no country in Europe has been affected by immigration of the last 2 centuries, actually, as Ireland. And this morning in our Irish Studies seminar, we talked about the Great Irish Famine, and I'm sure many of you know about that. So period of starvation and illness in the 19th century onwards. So approximately 10 million people have immigrated from Ireland from or since 1800 up to this day. So I think this is a huge topic, actually. And this is why I think it has to be dealt with in an EFL classroom situation. Okay, now let's continue with, yes, why Brooklyn in the ELT, in the EFL classroom? Bianca, you wanted to say something to this question.
Yes, in my opinion, it is very important to show the students that migration is always, or the migrant stories are always individual. So if we just read statistics and we know how many people migrated to the USA, we might imagine them to be like a mass, a collective mass. But I think in Brooklyn, it was shown quite clear that there were so many migrants who were mentioned, Tony, Eilish, her brother. So each one of them had a unique story. And we also saw all facets, like all aspects of migration. Also, what I found very impressive was like the homesickness period in her life. And it's not just a decision that you make in an instant, like I'm gonna go there tomorrow and then I'm going to build a better life, because there's so much to it. And I think also that was quite clearly shown in Brooklyn.
Exactly. Yes, you mentioned a lot of topics where I think students can relate to, basically. Yeah, thank you very much for this answer. Antonius.
I completely agree with Bianca, and I would add that I think it's especially fruitful to teach Brooklyn, as it also shows the humanity of the time. So Brooklyn doesn't feature perfect characters who do exactly the best thing that they could do, especially if we look at Eilish really struggling with her own decisions. She doesn't know, does she want to stay in Ireland? Would she leave Tony behind? So we see the struggle, and I think in the aspect of what's the use of literature, what can we as individuals learn from it, it's in connection to everything Bianca just said, simply interesting really what this time, or how this time really tasked people who went into a completely new environment and who were practically alien in a world where Eilish, for example, had luck that she had father flood, but let's just look at the plethora of examples of people who migrated to America but didn't have someone who could kind of lead them into a certain direction. So of course we don't get this perspective by reading Brooklyn, but we get at least the insight that this perspective also exists. So especially to learn, and I think this is something that literature, or why literature is especially interesting, is because we can make sense of the present by reading about the past. So also in this regard, I think Brooklyn is a great example for this.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for this great answer. To summarize it, I think the novel is generally connected to topics based on the human condition in a way. And it reflects, I would call it the whole panorama of human existence in all its complexity, even though she has somebody to connect and she has an Irish community, but still she's very alienated. And yes, and you can see this existence in what I just said, in all its complexity, but also in the ambivalence that human beings or human life just brings with it. Yeah, so I made up this collection that you could already see because you all have the slides. So these are basically the topics where I see that our students can easily connect. It's home and homesickness. You mentioned that, Bianca. First grade love, of course, marriage and divorce, identity and belonging. Where do I belong to? This is something youngsters usually have, their identity, and they do not really know where they belong to. But also death and mourning, because death is always a topic. Many people die actually in the novel. Hybrid identities, racial segregation is also mentioned in the United States. So you don't just learn about Ireland and immigration, but also about the way aliens were looked at in the United States in the 50s. And I think Tobin actually describes in great detail and very vividly how difficult it is to settle alone in a foreign country. And with Ireland, you've seen the pictures, Enniscorthy and New York City, I think two worlds kind of collide that could not be more different. Yes, and conservatism and liberalism is also a topic, but also emancipation, tradition, progress. So all these things are actually addressed in passing and round off the story around Eilish and yes, into a whole, basically. Also, you can see Ireland in the 50s versus life in the United States in the 50s, and the conflict in which Eilish finds herself after her return to Ireland is also portrayed and complete, I think, in a very, very comprehensible way. So I think it would be a novel that students can easily follow and could understand also language-wise. So these feelings of turmoil and doubts about your own identity, the right future, the right choice of the future, and also the fear of making a decision. I think this is actually portrayed in a very, I would call it a very true to life and a very empathetic way. Yes, we also have, you see it here in this list, a gender and role image of women in the 1950s. For example, Eilish and her sister, they feel responsible for the care of their aging mother in a way that their brothers do not, because they left the country and they live in England, and they expect it from the sisters to do that. So another thing is this all affects her future. And she also, she feels kind of pressured, at least this is what I read between the lines. She feels of pressure to want marriage and a family, even though she does not really feel ready for those things. Yes, and then of course the overarching theme, of course, is the emigration, not only to the United States, but also to England, simply due to lack of future perspectives and economic reasons. We just talked about that. Now, Ina also already mentioned something about, yes, the identities. And what I see in this book, and this is also a reason why I would read it in a classroom, is you have this Irish community in the United States. So you have Irishness versus Irishness in America. And then you have Italianness, and they all kind of intermingle. So features of Irishness, for instance, are names, religion, praying, sport, for instance, hurling, food and drinks are very often mentioned, such as tea, potatoes, And I don't know if you remember, Diana constantly complains about the food in the boarding house, and she says it is too Irish. And you also have those features on a similar level, Italianness, such as clothes. They are described wearing funny hats, but also food and drink is a topic again. So they eat spaghetti, of course, they drink thick and bitter coffee in tiny cups, is mentioned in one situation. And also those close-knit contacts and rope networks Italians are supposed to have are very often mentioned. And also the Italian gigolo man, which Tony is not, but it is mentioned that this is kind of an Italianness. You also have features of Americanness, such as the American dream, of course, land of the free and the brave, all the opportunities they are offered, but also multiculturalism. And also, well, things such as baseball, fashion, shopping, etc., etc. So what I find amazing is that everyone, particularly Eilish herself, is reading everyone else for clues of their nationality, their culture, their class, and even their race. So often there are references to red hair in quite a subtle way, which is a desire for an assimilation, but at the same time also, I see it also as a desire for separation, which we get through visual cues. And I think this is kind of, yeah, a wonderful kind of interesting features of this novel. I think we have actually run out of time, but I said, okay, if I ask my last question, how can...
I think you officially have 4 or 5 more minutes anyways, because we are 5 minutes behind the schedule.
That's great to have them officially. Yes. Yeah, so how can Brooklyn be taught in the EFL classroom? So how would you go about if you say, well, I decided, or maybe the class and me together, we decided to read Brooklyn. What would you do, basically, methodology-wise? I mentioned the pre, while, and post reading options. So what would you choose? How would you enter the novel? How would you start? Ruben.
So for the reading assignments, I would probably go about to teach and bring in some of the facts we heard earlier today about Irish American immigration, Americanization, and in that context, because it really shows how it can work and what's the good part, what's the bad part of it, and then it's follow-up reading the book probably. And then later on, you can revisit it and ask students, for example, did they like it? What the book brought them? Did they understood the problematic that was here before the reading, and so on?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Actually, just as a warm-up, I would never just give them the novel. So as an introduction, this would be a great idea. How can you help students to make it just short? Because you see it actually on the slides. How can you help them in while reading? So basically, the pre-reading are actually activities for a first encounter, just not to give them this kind of cold start that usually activates the prior knowledge, lead them into the topic, motivates them to read, etc. But what can you do or why do we basically need while reading activities?
To keep the students interested and keep them thinking about a book, because I think every single person in this room knows that when you're reading a text, especially like a more a harder text, and it's not a first language, your thoughts, they tend to go elsewhere and you're not in the book anymore or in the text. So if you have a simple question, maybe, so how does the character feel, what is she going through, then the students have to keep that in mind and kind of have to answer it while reading. And so I think that can help to make a text more interesting.
Yeah, and I think it just helps text comprehension, not to lose your students, and also text reader interaction, maybe also train reading strategies, how to read, and also intensify their participation in the whole reading process. This is why the why of reading activities, or what they are good for. Well, we could expand on post-reading activities. They should, this is what I always say, they should be as creative as possible to lead the students deeper into the topics, into the whole plot, into the character development, etc. But I think, yeah, we should call it a day. And if you're interested, there will be a talk in January on the novel Brooklyn, and there I can expand a bit more on pre, while, and post-reading activities for the seminars we brought. They will probably be involved in that, so they can listen there carefully. And I think I can finish here now. So thank you very much for participating, and thank you very much also for your very good questions and your interest. I thank you all for all your talks, and for all the interesting discussions and the great ideas we got within this whole study day, I would say. Now in the program, you can see a break. The question is actually whether you need a break, or shall we continue with the discussion right away? No, I think most of you appreciate it if we just have the place now, or the time, to ask questions to whoever talked today. I think just Caitríona had to leave. I don't see her name. Okay, so is there anything you would like to come back to, or are there any questions? Any?
I think before we do that, Maria, I think it would be appropriate for me to thank you for that wonderful paper. It really was a masterclass. You know, it began with sketching very broad strokes the conceptual and theoretical framework in which this is done, and then you very skillfully focused and applied those ideas to the analysis and interpretation of a novel, how it can be viewed in that way. And as I said, I think it was an absolute masterclass. Thank you very much. We send you our virtual applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Can I ask, is it okay if I ask this question that occurred to me? You know, when you were talking about the role of literary literacy in negotiating people's ways through, you know, the ambiguities and complexities of culture and culture differences, can that only be done in English, or is English better than other languages in doing that? I mean, I'm asking this because, you know, in Ireland we are essentially monolingual. Despite pretenses and claims to be otherwise. And you know, when I'm bringing my students abroad, perhaps next month, but they'll go and they'll visit where we're visiting, and in the expectation that everybody else will be able to converse in English, which is an awful assumption, and I think it's sort of, you know, it leads to it's impoverishing for them, because they don't have to learn, they don't have to do the difficult task of acquiring another language.
Yeah, but these are two questions in a way. So maybe I first answer your first question. Of course, you can enhance literary literacy in all other languages. For instance, if you're a French teacher and you have brought your students as far as to understand a novel, and they have a good language proficiency, good language competence, then of course you can have the same experience, hopefully. I know there is some critique about it, because some of my colleagues say, well, if you deal with literature, they all become better people, but in the end of the day, they don't, you know, and so we don't have a proof really. This is what we assume, and it's very hard to test and to check. So this is to your first part of the question, but I'm sure that you could do that or reach those goals. The second one is, well, English, which is unfortunate for you, is the lingua franca, and everybody kind of speaks it or tries to have a language proficiency in English language. So maybe then it is better, or it is easier to do that with our students, because when you ask them, well, do you prefer learning English or French or Italian or Spanish, they usually prefer learning English because all the pop songs are in English. So it is not hard actually to transfer or to make them learn English, basically.
Sure.
Yeah, but
yeah,
I know
I'm
problem, because usually when I used to have a students exchange, and when the students from Ireland came to Germany, they were so disappointed. They said, I went to the supermarket and started to speak some of my maybe poor German, and then they all answered in English, even all the shop assistants and everybody. And this is I know it's a problem.
But it's very interesting to see that development take hold, because as the lingua franca, it's the conduit for cosmopolitanism. It's the cosmopolitan language, just as Latin was in the ancient world. And you were judged against that. You were actually judged. Your level of civility was determined by your ability to engage in the language in the discourse of authority. It'll cause sorts of difficulties. It is causing difficulties if that happens with English. But I think following Brexit, that will bring changes, because I think many of the Brexiters are about to jump off the flat earth they inhabit. I might ask, I see two other hands up there. Ina, do you want to ask a question? And then Antonios.
I don't know if Antonios wanted to respond directly to what what you two have been talking about.
It's not really connected. So if your remark is connected to it, then I'll just wait.
Oh, no, mine are not connected. Okay. So you can go ahead.
Too polite.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so our topic for today was discovering Irish identity, but throughout all the talks, pretty much every identity that was the focus, or the identities that we focused on, were hybrid identities, at least to some degree. And I just have to look for a quote. Not really an interview, but it was an essay about Joseph O'Connor, an Irish author. And the author of the essay was kind of criticizing that O'Connor has the certain blend of Americanness that seeps into his literature. And they're criticizing that the books are not really Irish, neither are they Irish American, but merely American. And I'll just read out the quote here. Before too long, O'Connor's engagement with the America represented by the tourist, so tourists from America to Ireland, begins to infiltrate and influence his own sense of identity. He begins to see his own heritage through the filter of Irish American culture. And I was a bit dumbfounded when I read over this quote, because especially when it comes to identity, I thought that it was a rather productive process where two identities kind of combine. And now, of course, Irish American identity with the hyphen in between is not just Irish identity, not just American identity. It's not just both of them combined. I know this was a bit of me rambling here, but I just wanted to hear about your opinion, so all of you, whether it is really detrimental, because the way I felt at least was that those American aspects blended into the Irish literature and then created something new, and not just overturned it and created it into something that was essentially American. But I of course might also be wrong here.
I mean, I think this also ties in with the Irish German, and also the can we say British Irish with regard to Patrick, Damian? So maybe that ties in with all of the texts, and that actually would have been my question or my comment. What, again, Antonios just right now quoted our title, Journeys Across the Waves, Discovering Irish Identity. I mean, what were we discovering today? Hybrid and liminal identities, or something like a pure Irish?
No, identity is situational. It depends on your place and the place where you're living and the time you're living in. so we need a rationalization of the world we live in, and that's what your identity is. Mm-hmm. I do some voluntary teaching in a secondary school, and that is a very interesting experience. So I'm talking to a class of 13 and 14-year-olds, and one of the students, we were looking at this question, and one of the students put their hand up and mentioned a normal Irish person, and there was uproar. There was uproar in the class. Now that wouldn't have happened in my era when when it was essentially monocultural, but somebody else stood up and talked to that student and said, "Look, your father is Irish. Your mother is French, born in Egypt. What is a normal Irish identity? It doesn't exist. It never existed. It doesn't exist." Mm-hmm. And that affects our attitudes towards migration, because we think of we think of migration in Irish history as a tragedy. Well, a lot of Irish people left precisely because of that, because it was a monocultural society, and it was a monocultural society that demanded a high degree of conformity. And if you didn't conform, or you weren't able to conform, or were not willing to conform, immigration was your answer. So you have people emigrating for very good and valid reasons, not economic reasons, but still equally very good and valid reasons. And I'll just point out that, in terms of Irish history, in the Middle Ages, it was a global history. It was, Irish history from literally from Adam and Eve up to the present, tracing the origins of the Irish people. And the book is known in the vernacular as Leabhar Gavala, or Leabhar Gavala Éireann, which means literally the book of the taking of Ireland, but its translation is the book of invasions. Irish identity, Irish people is composite and complex. Even its language, part of the book is, where did the Irish language come from? And they invent a figure called Féinius Farstad, who is around at the time of the creation of the Tower of Babel, when humans tried to build a tower up going to heaven, a shortcut to heaven, and God decided he was going to scupper their plans by, first of all, demolishing the tower, but also creating 72 different languages. And any community where they speak 72 different languages is not going to work. Look at the United Nations. So what happens is Féinius and his son go around to each of those 72 different languages, and they take what's best from those 72 languages and they put them together, and that's where the Irish language comes from, according to these sites. So we might laugh at that in our superior 21st century way, but it is a sophisticated attempt to locate yourself in history, and also to illustrate the fact that difference and hybridity, and what they called the complexio oppositorum, this meeting together of differences and negotiating differences, is absolutely essential for existence, for existence itself. So mm-hmm. cultures which are composite, cultures which are multicultural, are dynamic because they're creative. Mm-hmm. Monocultures are sterile.
If I may add something before you say something, Ina, just to, coming from EFL methodology, we are more and more getting away from this intercultural learning concept where you have these two entities, like culture A and culture B, and you learn about that, you focus that, and you learn about how do they do things, and maybe also areas, studies, features. We're getting more into transculturality, and nowadays we speak of global education because the focus should be more on similarities, and particularly if you have a look into the Western world, you have more similarities when it comes to young people, fashion, music, etc. So commonalities that they share compared to what makes them different, really. Ina, yeah.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. I think this whole transatlantic studies approach highlights this. No borders, border crossing, the nation state not as the central, or the national literature not as the central entity. And what Damian said, I think, also ties in with the new Irish studies, which kind of focus on diversity and alterity and highlight that a lot more as it was probably highlighted in the past, as Damian has also pointed out. Because if we even go back to Patrick, to come back to Damian's example, we see hybrid identities, we see immigration and emigration. And to come back to what Antonio said about, this criticism of Joseph O'Connor's writing, I think this may tie in with, there's an essay by Edna Longley, Irish Bards and American Audiences. And the gist of that essay is the American audience defines what is successful in Irish writing, and the American audience, which is, dominates the market, but the financial success of Irish literature is focusing, of course, on these issues of migration and immigration and the Irish-American situation, which Longley says kind of narrows down the broad scope of Irish literature, or has narrowed it down in the last decades. So maybe that ties in, this criticism ties in with that. But Ruben had his hand raised, I think, a quarter of an hour ago. So if that's still valid, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to add that on Antonio's question, or rather idea, that I just thought about it, that the culture itself and the identity of a culture, of every culture in the world, isn't right now just defined by itself. It's always through the globalism and everything going around right now defined by all different cultures, because of all we have so much influence through every different country, every different culture. Even in different countries, there are different kinds of cultures. So I just believe that one can't stand or can't try to go without influence of other cultures right now. Except maybe he lives in the woods and is lonely. So that I just wanted to add that. But I also had a question, a different one, if that's okay.
Of course.
I just wanted to ask Professor Bracken, I hope I pronounced it right, if you believe that your theme was worth noting in the EFL classroom in Germany.
Sorry, I missed that question. If
your theme, or the you were talking about St. Patrick, if that's more or less, it's very important for the history, of course, I understood that, but if it's also worth for students in the EFL classroom in Germany,
sure.
So not for students in the university, but for students who have much less time learning about it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And much less knowledge about the time itself also,
sure.
If it's worth, basically.
So I mean, as regards Patrick himself and his importance globally, well, if you look at what happens next March, 17th of March, this is one of he's sort of the symbol of Irish identity. But what's happened to him over the centuries is he becomes associated with one strand of Irish identity predominantly. What I was trying to do there was to engage critically with him, because I think studying him and his attitudes and the way he does negotiate his way through very complex and competing and very often mutually antagonistic identities is relevant, if I can use that word today as well. He's dealing with a world which is Roman. He's dealing with a world which is Celtic, stroke British, and he's dealing with a world which is Irish. And the question for Patrick is, what are you? So when he's asked if he is Roman, his answer is yes. When he's asked if he's British, his answer is yes. If he's asked, is he Irish, his answer is yes. So the attitude that he takes to identity is not territorial, it's cultural. And this is something that a former president of Ireland, Mary McAleese, who came from Northern Ireland, stressed. She said, if Irish people stop thinking about their identity in territorial ways and think about it much more in a much more malleable way, which is cultural, then you can be Irish, or you can be British, or you can be both, or you can be in Ulster and you can assert your British identity while at the same time acknowledging an Irish identity. So I do think that if Patrick stands at the fountainhead of Irish identity, I think there is a lot to be learned from him and his approach to the whole question of Irish identity. So I think the fact that he is so distant in time gives us some sort of sense of perspective. The problem with Patrick is that his writing is not easy to understand. His writing for a modern readership, as I said, what he writes is rebarbative because we are from very, very different worlds. But I think that the values that he espouses, and he's in a part of the world where people were viewed as brute barbarians. And you just need to read some of Patrick's contemporaries in what they write about non-Romans and about Irish people as well, is that they are brutish in the sense that they are bestial. This extraordinarily these extraordinary pejorative and negative views of the Irish prevail. Patrick is the first voice which rejects those ideas. He's the first writer who rejects outright the ancient taxonomies of people based on how they are seen from a Roman perspective. So I think Patrick is a fascinating writer. He will demand, however, more of you to understand him than maybe Colm Tóibín would.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I see these as yes, great concluding words. Actually, Damian, thank you very much for this detailed answer. If there aren't any more questions or comments or anything else you would like to add, I think we can call it a day. So thank you very much.
Anna has a question.
There is one, yeah.
Last minute question. Go ahead.
It was very spontaneous, but it is kind of a comment just because of what Professor Bracken just said, that St. Patrick obviously tried to cut the ties to those ancient views that the Romans, for example, had of the Irish, that were barbaric or whatever. And I found it interesting, especially if we switch a few centuries forward, with the Irish revival in, for example, literature, where they try to focus again on this Celtic past to kind of strengthen the national identity again, and to kind of I'm missing the
right.
word.
I mean, because what happens is in the early historical period is you have Irish scholars who work on the continent, who work in the Germanic lands, and they recover manuscripts. The manuscript evidence of Ireland's cultural inheritance, Ireland's role, the role of Irish scholars as teachers who made a fundamentally important contribution to European identity at its formative stage. So what happens, as you said, when Ireland is seeking political independence, this comes very much to the fore again. So, what happens is you have the myth of the Irish as brute barbarians, but that's replaced in time by a new myth, which is equally crazy, of Ireland as the island of saints and scholars. But as I said, they're part of an identity, and all identity is situational. It responds to the cultural needs and exigencies of the time in which people are living. And what you're saying about that sort of vision of Ireland's golden age has a real political edge when you're looking at it in the 20th century. I would also say that the negative Roman perceptions of the Irish are also used for political purposes in history, because if you look at, when in the English conquest of Ireland, the figures that they're reading are the ancient Roman ethnographers, and they're reading ancient Roman perceptions of the Irish as brute barbarians. So the English argue the Romans came here, they beat the hell out of us, but they made us a great people. We're now going to do the same thing in Ireland. We're going to go to Ireland, we're going to beat the hell out of those people, and it will be for their good. So, I mean, these are ideas, and these are ideas in people's heads. But these ideas, they have life and death consequences. They were used for programs of genocide, full stop. The past is always present, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, that's true. And we have another question or comment, Antonius.
This is just a short remark to add to this concept of, well, we are taming the barbarian now, because especially I think when reading historical fiction just when reading in general about the 18th, 19th, 20th century, when it comes to relations between Ireland, Great Britain in general, or America, you have magazines like The Punch, for example, which frequently featured those caricatures where the Irish was portrayed as this brute, which really kind of creates this connection back into the Roman era, where we have pretty much those same descriptions, just not in cartoons, which are meant as satire. But I think it's really, we see this link, and we then also see this treatment where, of course, we shouldn't generalize it and say that everyone thought that this was the truth, but still, I think this was also used as propaganda in a way to also spur negative feelings towards this population, which then, of course, like you just said, also breeds violence. So it is quite a dangerous tool.
Yeah, it's the literature of dehumanization. And if you want to see it at work today, well, there are people freezing on the borders of our continent. That's the reality.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that's why I think all of what we discussed today is so pertinent and topical. I mean, when we close the study day in a few minutes, and you turn on your radio or your television set and you watch the news, you'll find exactly what we were talking about on the news today: different nationalities, different borders, different boundaries, but the same kind of story as Maria earlier said. It's part of the human condition, obviously. Yeah,
it is. Yeah. Great. So thank you very much for the talks and also for the discussion, for your interest, for taking part. I think you could take away, at least I take away a lot from this afternoon. And I hope you all did. And yes, I wish you all an enjoyable, relaxing evening. And could the ISWÜ team and maybe Damian, could you just stay here for a minute, just for a brief talk? And for all the others, have a nice evening. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.